Name of the story: The Last Bus Home. The clock in the corner of the bus stop flickered in the dim light, its hands inching closer to midnight. Mark had never been fond of late-night commutes, but tonight it felt different. The streets were eerily quiet, the hum of the city's usual noise barely audible in the distance. It had been a long day, one of those exhausting shifts that left him with more questions than answers, and all he wanted was to get home. But as he stood at the edge of the sidewalk, waiting for the bus, a strange unease began to creep over him. The familiar sound of tires on wet pavement grew louder, and soon enough, the bus appeared at the corner. The headlights pierced through the mist, casting an otherworldly glow over the empty streets. Mark squinted, trying to make out the figure behind the wheel. There was something about the driver's face that he couldn't quite place, a sort of stillness, an unnatural calm that seemed out of place for someone who was supposed to be awake at this hour. The bus doors opened with a hiss, and he stepped inside, glancing around at the nearly empty seats. He was the only one on the bus at first, which was odd considering the usual late-night crowd. He slid into a seat by the window, noticing the dim lighting that flickered intermittently as the bus began its journey through the foggy streets. As the vehicle rumbled forward, he felt his eyelids grow heavy, the exhaustion of the day pulling at him. But then the bus didn't seem quite right. The air was stale, too thick for his liking, and the further they traveled, the more unsettled he became. He caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing near the back of the bus. At first, it looked like a person, tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing, but there was no movement, no signs of life. It was as if they were standing completely still, staring straight ahead. Mark tried to shake it off, convincing himself that his tired mind was playing tricks on him. But then the figure moved, slowly, unnaturally. It turned its head, meeting Mark's gaze through the reflection of the mirror. A chill ran down his spine, and his breath hitched in his throat. He glanced around the bus again. It was still mostly empty, save for a couple of passengers sitting near the back. They were a strange group, silent, rigid, their faces hidden in shadow. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the situation. There was something off about them, something he couldn't put into words. Their eyes were too wide, their skin too pale. They didn't move like normal people, and their eyes, those eyes, were locked on him now. He tried to focus on the streets outside, but the darkness pressed in on him, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. The bus continued to rattle down the deserted road, each turn making Mark feel more isolated, more trapped. And then it happened. One of the passengers, a woman sitting near the back, stood up. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if each step was calculated. Mark couldn't tear his eyes away from her. She wasn't walking. She was gliding, her feet barely touching the floor of the bus. The woman's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes never left Mark's. Panic surged through him. He looked toward the driver, hoping to find some kind of normalcy, some reassurance that he wasn't imagining all of this. But the driver was still as motionless as before, his eyes fixed forward, unblinking. Mark swallowed hard. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Is there something wrong with the bus?" No answer. Not from the driver, and certainly not from the passengers. They just kept staring. Mark's stomach twisted in knots. Something wasn't right here. He needed to get off the bus. But the next stop wasn't coming. The bus was moving too fast, too relentlessly, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. The woman near the back took another step toward him. Her lips curled into a smile, a grotesque, unnatural smile that made Mark's blood run cold. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears, the sweat forming on his brow. "What do you want?" he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you people?" The smile on her face widened. The other passengers began to shift in their seats, standing now, their eyes locked on him. The air around him grew thick with tension, as if the entire bus had become suffused with something otherworldly, something ancient and predatory. He reached for the door, his fingers trembling as he gripped the cold metal. But it didn't open. The doors wouldn't budge. And then, with a sudden jolt, the bus lurched forward, faster now, as if it had entered some kind of twisted, alternate reality. Mark's head spun. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the predatory stares of the passengers who were no longer human. They weren't people at all, he realized with sudden clarity. They were something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him, watching him. A voice, cold and dry like the whisper of a forgotten ghost, echoed from the back of the bus. "You shouldn't have gotten on." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The voice was hollow, lifeless. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the seats, the darkness itself. It was as if the entire bus was speaking to him. He pressed himself back into his seat, trying to make himself smaller, as if that could make him invisible. But there was no escaping them now. The passengers were moving closer, their gliding steps dragging them across the floor. Each of them, every single one, had that same unnatural smile, that same dead look in their eyes. A cold sweat poured down Mark's face as he tried to find a way out. The bus was speeding now, faster than he had ever experienced. The lights flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and distort. And then the figure at the front of the bus, the driver, turned his head slowly. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he locked eyes with the man, or what used to be a man. The driver's face was a mask of pale, stretched skin, hollow eyes staring into Mark's soul. The voice echoed once more, "You've been chosen." Mark's world was spiraling into madness. The walls of the bus seemed to warp around him, and the faces of the passengers distorted, their features melting into grotesque, monstrous shapes. The bus was no longer on the road. It was suspended in some kind of endless void, and Mark realized, with terrifying clarity, that there was no escape. The last bus home had already claimed him. The bus rumbled on, its headlights casting an eerie glow across the now foreign streets. Mark's mind raced as he tried to process the impossible reality unfolding before him. The bus was no longer driving through a city he recognized. The buildings outside the windows had warped into strange, distorted shapes, their windows empty and dark, their silhouettes looming like silent watchers. He tried to scream, to call out for help, but his voice was lost in the thick silence that had overtaken the bus. The passengers, if they could still be called that, remained motionless, their eyes fixed on him, their smiles never fading. There was something about the way they stood, the way they glided, that made his skin crawl. It was unnatural, something that shouldn't be possible in the world he knew. A soft, raspy whisper drifted through the air, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere. "You're one of us now. You belong here, just like the rest of us." Mark's chest tightened as he turned to face the source of the voice. The woman who had been standing closest to him was now standing directly in front of his seat, her face mere inches from his own. Her eyes were wide and hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the very light around her. Her lips curled into that same unnatural smile. "No," Mark gasped, backing away instinctively. "I don't belong here. Let me off this bus." The woman's head tilted slightly, her gaze unblinking, studying him with an eerie curiosity. "You think you can leave?" she asked, her voice soft, almost pitying. "This bus doesn't stop. You're already too far gone. There's no turning back." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around for an escape, but there was no way out. The door remained closed, the windows too high for him to reach. His mind was a whirl of panic and confusion. He had to get off the bus. He had to escape. Suddenly, the bus jolted again, the sound of the engine sputtering as if the vehicle itself were struggling to stay in motion. The lights flickered violently, casting the interior of the bus into darkness before returning with an even more unsettling glow. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening, making it hard to breathe. The figures in the seats around him shifted, slowly, deliberately. They weren't just watching him anymore, they were moving toward him, surrounding him. Each step they took seemed too slow, too deliberate, as if they were savoring the moment, waiting for something. Mark's throat tightened as he realized the truth. These weren't just people, they were something else. Something dark, something ancient, and they had been waiting for him. Waiting for someone to take the last bus home. "Stop," he choked out, his voice barely audible over the eerie hum of the bus's engine. "What do you want from me?" The woman with the hollow eyes leaned closer, her cold breath brushing against his skin. "We've been waiting for someone like you," she whispered. "Someone who doesn't belong. Someone who's lost." The other passengers began to close in, their movements slow and unnerving. The bus continued to accelerate, faster and faster, as if it were being pulled into some unseen force, dragging them all towards something Mark couldn't comprehend. A sharp pain pierced his side. He looked down to see one of the passengers, an older man with an unsettlingly elongated neck, reached out, his fingers cold and dry, pressing against Mark's ribs. "Don't touch me!" Mark shouted, jerking away, but the man's grip tightened. "You can't escape," the man croaked, his voice rasping with age and malice. "This is where we all end up. The bus never stops. The ride never ends." Mark's vision blurred as his mind scrambled to find a way out. The terror was overwhelming, the realization sinking in that he was trapped. Trapped with these creatures. The bus wasn't just a vehicle. It was a prison, and he had boarded it willingly, thinking it would take him home. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the horrific sight of the passengers around him, their eyes gleaming with an otherworldly hunger. The bus swerved, the screeching of its wheels slicing through the thick, suffocating air. And then, for a moment, everything went silent. Mark opened his eyes and found himself standing. He wasn't in his seat anymore. He was in the aisle, surrounded by the still forms of the passengers. They were no longer gliding. They were motionless, like statues, their eyes fixed on the front of the bus. The lights flickered once more, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The driver's seat was empty now, the figure that had once occupied it nowhere to be seen. "Where are we?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling as he stumbled backward. No one answered. The bus was no longer moving forward. It had come to a complete stop. Mark's heart thudded in his chest as he realized that the city outside was gone. There were no familiar streets, no landmarks. There was only darkness, an abyss that stretched beyond the windows. The world had disappeared, leaving only the bus and the creatures within it. "Where are we?" he repeated, louder this time, his voice growing more frantic. Still no response. But one of the passengers, the woman who had been standing so close to him earlier, shifted slightly. Her lips parted, and her voice rang out, low and haunting. "You're here now, with us," she said, her voice echoing in the empty space of the bus. "And we never leave. We never go home." Mark's breath caught in his throat as he realized the horrifying truth. The last bus home wasn't meant to take him to safety. It wasn't meant to take him anywhere at all. It was a journey with no end, a ride that would continue forever, spiraling into darkness. And as the doors of the bus slowly closed behind him, Mark felt the weight of the eternal ride settling upon him. He was never going home. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the thudding a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had enveloped the bus. It was as though time itself had come to a standstill, leaving him in this moment of sheer terror, suspended in an endless loop. The woman with the hollow eyes turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him once more. Her smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too many, like a predator savoring its prey. "You thought you were just taking the last bus home," she whispered, her voice soft and dripping with malice. "But you've come to the end of the line." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry as if he hadn't spoken in days. His mind scrambled for any shred of logic, any reason that would make sense of the madness unfolding before him, but there was none. These people, these things weren't human. They weren't even alive in the way he understood it. They existed somewhere between the realm of the living and the dead, bound together by whatever twisted fate had brought them here. The bus was no longer a simple vehicle. It was a vessel, an entity unto itself, carrying them all through dimensions unknown. He was trapped. He had no way out. But that didn't stop him from trying. Mark stumbled toward the rear door, his hands trembling as he reached for the handle. He pushed and pulled, desperate to get out, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it were locked from the outside, or maybe it never had been able to open in the first place. His breath came in shallow gasps as he turned around, frantically looking for another way out. The other passengers were moving again, gliding toward him in that unnatural, eerie fashion. Their eyes were fixed on him, their bodies bent in grotesque angles. They were closing in, and Mark knew deep down that it wasn't just because they wanted him. No, it was something worse. They needed him. He was the last piece of their puzzle, the last piece to complete their torment. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He raised his fists as though they could protect him from whatever was coming, but the air was thick with the scent of something rotten, something ancient. It clung to his skin, making him feel as though he were suffocating. A soft chuckle echoed from the woman with hollow eyes. She reached forward, her fingers long and bony, brushing the side of his cheek with surprising tenderness. "You can fight all you want," she purred, "but it won't change anything. You've already accepted the ride." Mark's eyes darted around in panic. There had to be something, anything, that could help him escape. His thoughts were disjointed, swirling with confusion and fear, but then he saw it. In the far corner of the bus, something faintly glimmered, like a distant light. It was almost imperceptible at first, but it grew stronger with every second. A narrow beam of light that sliced through the oppressive darkness. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Without thinking, Mark sprinted toward it, ignoring the pain in his legs, ignoring the cold fingers that seemed to reach out and brush against his skin, trying to stop him. He reached the light, barely able to see as his hand gripped the source, a small, old-fashioned emergency hatch. The panic that had been smothering him surged again, flooding his veins with adrenaline. He yanked the hatch open with a force he didn't know he had, revealing a narrow tunnel. The light seemed to be coming from there, beckoning him forward like a lifeline. Mark didn't hesitate. He crawled through the opening, his mind numb to everything but the singular drive to escape. Behind him, he could hear the shuffling of feet, the dragging sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. They were following him. He pulled himself further into the tunnel, the walls closing in around him as the light at the end grew brighter. Each movement felt slower, more labored as the air grew thinner, colder. He had to get out. He had to keep moving. But then the light flickered. For a split second, everything went dark again. Mark froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He strained to listen, but all he could hear was the soft, unsettling hum of the bus and the whispering voices of the passengers behind him. They were closer now, so close. He could feel their presence pressing against his back. The light flickered again, this time staying on for a few moments longer. He breathed a sigh of relief and pushed forward, crawling faster now, his hands scrabbling against the cold metal. Then, without warning, something grabbed his ankle. Mark screamed, his body jerking forward in a desperate attempt to escape. He twisted around, his eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. No one was touching him. It was as if the darkness itself had reached out and seized him. Panic flooded his mind, and he scrambled forward, ignoring the pain in his limbs, ignoring the fear clawing at his throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the end of the tunnel. There was a small door, just a sliver of an opening, but enough for him to crawl through. Mark shoved himself through, gasping for air as he emerged into a small, dimly lit room. But the room wasn't what he had expected. Instead of an escape, he found himself standing in a narrow alleyway, one he didn't recognize. The buildings around him were crooked, decayed, and the streets were bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. It wasn't the city he had known. It was something else. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, and Mark spun around. The bus was there, parked at the end of the alley, its headlights casting a strange glow that reflected off the crumbling walls. The door opened slowly, and one by one, the passengers stepped off, their faces twisted into grotesque, unnatural smiles. "You're not leaving," the woman's voice called out softly from the bus. Mark's stomach dropped as he realized the terrifying truth. No matter how far he ran, no matter what he did, he was still trapped in their world. The bus, the passengers, the eerie alley, they were all part of the same nightmare. He had taken the last bus home, but there was no home left to go to. And now Mark was just another passenger, bound to ride forever. As Mark stood frozen in the alleyway, the cold air wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud, he tried to grasp what had just happened. The overwhelming sense of dread that had consumed him was now replaced by a numbness, a feeling of helplessness that paralyzed his limbs. The figures that had stepped off the bus moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, their eyes never leaving him, their smiles still stretched unnervingly wide. He backed away, his feet scraping against the rough asphalt. His mind was racing, scrambling to find an explanation, a way to break free from whatever nightmare he had stumbled into. But each passing moment made it clearer that there was no escaping this. The world around him was warped, twisted beyond recognition. It felt as though time had folded in on itself, trapping him in a loop from which there was no exit. The woman with the hollow eyes stepped forward, her steps soundless, her head tilting slightly as if inspecting him. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice smooth and cold, like the brush of a forgotten memory. "This place, this bus, it isn't just about travel. It's about something much darker. And once you're on board, there's no getting off." Mark's breath hitched. "What do you want from me?" His voice was weak, a mere whisper of its former strength. The woman's smile widened, impossibly wide. "We don't want anything from you, Mark. We need you. You're part of the final journey." Mark's eyes darted around the alley, his pulse quickening as the other passengers slowly encircled him. He turned his back to them, his heart racing, each breath coming faster than the last. He had to find a way out. He had to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The alley stretched endlessly, the buildings growing more distorted with every glance. The world itself seemed to be warping, closing in on him. The streetlights flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the pavement. As Mark stepped backward, his foot caught on something soft, causing him to stumble. He fell to the ground with a grunt, his hands landing on the rough surface beneath him. When he looked up, he froze. Lying on the ground, just inches from him, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. It looked out of place in this twisted version of reality, like a relic from another world. Mark reached out, trembling, and grabbed it, unfolding it carefully. The note was written in a hurried, jagged script, smeared as if the ink had bled from the page. It read, "The bus doesn't stop. You can never leave. If you try to escape, the shadows will come for you. Just stay on the ride. It's safer that way. Trust the passengers." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a warning, but more than that, they felt like a truth he couldn't deny. He could hear the soft shuffle of feet behind him and realized, with a sinking dread, that the passengers were getting closer. They were waiting, watching. "Stay with us," the woman's voice purred again, and Mark could feel her presence at his back now. "It's not so bad. We're all just waiting for the next stop." Mark's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face her. Her eyes were dark and hollow, her expression unreadable, as though her humanity had long since drained away. The others stood behind her, silent and still, their faces vacant. No, Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough. "I won't stay here. I'll fight." A low chuckle rippled through the crowd of passengers. The sound was chilling, hollow, as though it came from somewhere deep beneath the earth. "You can't fight something that's already taken you, Mark," the woman said, her tone mocking. "We've been here longer than you. We know this place. It's all you have now. It's all you'll ever have." The sky above him darkened, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears, his body frozen by a paralyzing fear. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the shadows stretching longer and longer, as if reaching out for him. A cold hand touched his shoulder. Mark whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was no one there. The hand had been nothing more than a phantom touch, a manifestation of his fear. But it wasn't just his fear that had drawn them here. The bus, the passengers, the twisted alleyway. This was all part of a place that he had somehow stepped into, a place beyond the normal world. A place where the lines between the living and the dead blurred, where souls wandered in limbo, trapped in the endless cycle of the bus. And Mark was no different from them. He had boarded the last bus home, and now there was no going back. The others, the ones who had been riding for what felt like eternity, were no longer just passengers. They were the guardians of this nightmarish reality. They existed in the shadows, waiting for the next lost soul to join them. And Mark had joined them. He was one of them now. As the light from the street lamps flickered and died, Mark's world went dark. The bus doors closed behind him, sealing him in with the others. The wheels of the bus began to turn again, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it rolled down a road that no one could see, heading toward a destination unknown. The passengers didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were all in the same place now, and the bus would never stop. As the bus continued down its endless path, the flickering of the dim lights overhead cast shadows that stretched and shifted like living things. Mark sat in one of the worn-out seats, his hands trembling as he clutched the armrests, trying to make sense of what had happened. The woman who had spoken to him earlier sat across from him now, her hollow eyes studying him in silence. The others, the passengers who had been here far longer than him, were scattered throughout the bus, some staring out the window, others lost in their own thoughts. They were all dead, Mark realized, trapped in a limbo of their own making. The sound of the bus's tires rolling over the asphalt was the only noise that filled the air, a monotonous hum that blended with the eerie silence that seemed to pervade the bus. The world outside the windows was a blur, a void of darkness with no landmarks, no signs of life. It was as if the bus was moving through a void, a place outside of time and space. The woman across from him spoke again, her voice soft and distant, as though she were speaking to herself rather than to him. "You're starting to understand now, aren't you?" Mark nodded slowly, his mind racing. "This place, what is it? Where are we?" Her lips curled into a faint smile, though it was far from comforting. "We are in between. the in-between, the space between the living and the dead. Some of us, we were just passing through. Others like you, Mark, were too curious for their own good. Mark shuddered, his thoughts swirling with fear and confusion. He had always thought the supernatural was just a story, something made up to frighten children. But now, as he sat in this bus with these strange, silent passengers, he realized that there was a truth far darker than anything he had ever imagined. "But I didn't," he began, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure how to explain himself. He hadn't meant to end up here, on this bus, in this nightmare. The woman leaned in slightly, her eyes glinting with a strange, knowing light. "You didn't mean to, but you did. That's the thing about this place. You never really mean to end up here. You just do." Mark clenched his fists, trying to hold back the wave of panic that threatened to overtake him. "How do we get out? How do we leave?" The woman's smile faded, and for a moment, her expression became almost sorrowful. "You don't leave. Not until the bus reaches its final stop. And when it does, you'll understand. You'll become one of us." Mark's stomach churned at the thought, and he looked around the bus at the faces of the other passengers. They were all dead. He could see it now, their eyes, empty and lifeless, their movements stiff and unnatural. They were like marionettes, stuck in a never-ending loop, bound to the bus and its destination. "I won't become like you," Mark said, his voice shaking but filled with defiance. "I won't. I'll find a way out. There's always a way out." The woman's expression softened, but there was a coldness to it, as if she pitied him. "There's no way out, Mark. Not for you. Not for anyone on this bus. The only way out is to accept your place here." Mark stood abruptly, his knees weak, his mind reeling with disbelief. He had to get off. He had to escape. There had to be a way. He rushed toward the door, but as his hand touched the cold metal handle, the bus jolted, and the lights flickered violently. He felt a pressure in the air, a heavy weight pushing against him, as if something were pulling him back. He turned, panic rising in his chest. The passengers were no longer sitting silently. They were standing now, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Their eyes were locked on him, their expressions hollow and unfeeling. "No!" Mark shouted, backing away. "Stay away from me." But the woman's voice cut through the chaos, soft and calm, like a whisper in the dark. "It's too late, Mark. You've already crossed the line. You're one of us now." Mark stumbled backward, his heart racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tried to push past the passengers, but they surrounded him, their hands cold and firm, holding him in place. "No! Let go of me!" he screamed, but they didn't listen. They never had. The bus was moving faster now, the world outside the windows an endless blur of shadows and darkness. The pressure in the air grew heavier, the weight of the bus's motion pulling him down, suffocating him. The woman's voice was a low murmur in his ear. "There's no escape. Not anymore. The bus has claimed you." Mark's vision blurred as he struggled against the hands that gripped him, but it was no use. The bus continued its relentless journey, moving through the darkness toward an unknowable destination. And Mark knew deep down that there was no turning back. He had boarded the last bus home, and now it would carry him to the end of the line. As the passengers closed in around him, Mark's screams echoed in the hollow, empty space, but no one could hear him. The bus rolled on, and with it, his fate was sealed. Mark's struggles grew weaker as the hands tightened around him, and the world around him blurred even more. The faces of the passengers now pressed so close to him that he could smell the faint, musty scent of decay, seemed to merge into a single, grotesque mask of hollow eyes and motionless lips. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest aching with each frantic movement. Desperately, he tried to scream again, but the words felt trapped in his throat, as though the air itself was choking him. The more he struggled, the more the suffocating grip of the bus seemed to tighten. The woman who had spoken to him before, the one with the hollow eyes, leaned in close, her face mere inches from his. Her cold, empty gaze pierced through him like a blade. "You've been here before, Mark," she whispered, her voice sending a shiver down his spine. "You don't remember it, but you've been here. You've always been here." Mark's heart pounded, his thoughts spinning in disarray. Been here before? What was she talking about? "I don't know what you mean," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the bus and the other passengers. The pressure on his chest was overwhelming, like the entire weight of the world was pressing down on him. The woman's smile was thin, almost mocking. "That's how it works, Mark. You come back, over and over again. The bus doesn't just take you anywhere. It takes you back to where you started. You never truly leave." The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't trapped just in this moment, in this bus, with these dead passengers. He was caught in an endless cycle, a loop that stretched on for eternity. Every time he thought he was getting close to escaping, to understanding, to breaking free, the bus would return him to the beginning, back to where he started. Mark shuddered, his body racked with the cold dread of inevitability. He had tried to run before, tried to fight it, but now he understood. This wasn't just a nightmare. It was a prison made of time, of space, and of the passengers who would never leave. The other passengers were still silent, still watching him with their unblinking eyes. Their hands remained firm on his shoulders like shackles, holding him in place. The bus creaked, the engine rumbling with a low, ominous growl. It was as though the very vehicle itself was alive, aware of the passengers' suffering, feeding off their fear and despair. In a desperate attempt to break free, Mark tried to push against the passengers who surrounded him. He fought with all his strength, his hands clawing at the arms that held him. But they didn't budge. It was as though they were made of stone, their grip unyielding. The woman's voice was in his ear again, soft and steady, but full of dark amusement. "You'll never escape, Mark. You're part of the journey now. And once you've boarded this bus, there's no getting off." Her words were like ice in his veins. The more she spoke, the more Mark felt himself slipping away. His body, his mind, they were both starting to break down, to succumb to the reality of his endless imprisonment. There was no escape. There would never be an end. The world outside the windows was a blur of motion, darkness, and shadow. No light, no color, just an infinite abyss that stretched on forever. The bus seemed to be speeding up, faster and faster, as though it were hurtling toward an unknown destination. But in the back of Mark's mind, he knew it didn't matter where the bus was going. It was the same place every time, the same destination, and it was the last stop. As the minutes bled into hours, Mark's thoughts began to unravel. His mind became a hazy fog, and the hopelessness settled in like a heavy weight in his chest. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but even that felt pointless now. There was no one to hear him, no one to save him. And then, as if the bus itself had sensed his surrender, the doors opened with a sudden, jarring screech. The world outside had changed. No longer was it the endless stretch of darkness. Instead, there was a faint glow, a soft light that seemed to come from nowhere, yet everywhere. The passengers, the dead, began to shuffle toward the exit, their hollow eyes still locked on Mark. He didn't move. He couldn't. One by one, they passed through the doors, disappearing into the light beyond. They were leaving, but Mark knew he wasn't going anywhere. He was stuck forever. The woman from earlier was the last to stand, her cold gaze lingering on him. She gave him a pitying smile, the corners of her lips curling upward. "You'll see them again, Mark," she whispered. over and over, until you forget who you were. And with that, she stepped off the bus, vanishing into the light. The doors closed with a final, deafening bang. The bus rumbled on, once again alone in the void. Mark was no longer fighting. He didn't have the strength. The cycle would continue, just as it always had, and he would be a part of it forever. The last bus had no end, no beginning. It was only a journey, and Mark had boarded it, never to disembark. The bus continued its monotonous hum as it sped through the endless expanse, the dim light from the overheads casting ghostly shadows along the narrow aisles. Mark sat, his body numb and his mind still trapped in a haze of disbelief. The woman's words echoed in his ears, as though they were branded into his very soul. "You'll see them again, Mark." He could still feel her presence lingering, her gaze cold and pitying. He tried to focus, to will himself out of this nightmare, but each time his thoughts began to form, they crumbled into oblivion. His mind was a prisoner to the endless loop, and the more he struggled to break free, the more the reality of it all set in. Outside, the city passed by, an indistinct blur of lights and dark streets. The bus, as if aware of his despair, seemed to glide effortlessly through time. There was no sense of passing hours, no sense of day or night. It was as though the very concept of time had ceased to exist. The world beyond the glass was just as void of meaning, a never-ending landscape that didn't belong to any particular moment or place. For a while, Mark simply sat there, frozen, his mind trapped in the same thought over and over. How had he gotten here? What had he done to deserve this? He thought of his life before the bus, before the endless hours that seemed to stretch on in every direction. He had been just another commuter, rushing home after a long day. But now he was something else. He had crossed some invisible line, and now there was no turning back. The other passengers had all but disappeared, leaving Mark alone in the shadow of the bus. Their absence wasn't comforting. It only served to reinforce the overwhelming sense of isolation. The bus felt more like a tomb than a vehicle now, a hollow shell drifting through a void where nothing lived and nothing changed. There was no escape. There was no end. But then, as if to remind him of the futility of his situation, the doors opened once again. A cold gust of wind swept through the bus, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth. Mark didn't want to look, didn't want to see the passengers filing out, leaving him behind once more. But curiosity gnawed at him, and he lifted his head. One by one, the shadows began to shift, and the ghostly figures that had haunted the aisles began to rise. They moved like slow, mechanical puppets, no haste, no urgency, just a dull, inevitable march toward the exit. Mark could see them now, clearer than ever. Their eyes, wide and vacant, stared straight ahead, their faces locked in expressions of apathy. Some of them had faces that looked almost human, but others were mere voids, empty spaces where a face should have been. And then, as the last of them stepped off the bus, the door swung shut with a loud thud, sealing Mark inside once again. The engine purred back to life, the lights flickered, and the bus lurched forward as though it had always been in motion. Mark was alone. He was alone again, but this time it felt different. This time, there was no one left to haunt him, no one left to pull him deeper into the never-ending loop. The silence was suffocating, and for the first time since the bus had started, Mark could feel the weight of his own existence pressing down on him. What did it mean to be alone in a place like this? He couldn't understand it. He didn't know if it was possible to be truly alone when everything around him seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The bus was alive in its own way, feeding off the fear of the passengers, cycling them through until they had nothing left to give. Mark's fingers brushed the cold, glass window beside him. He was staring out into the void, watching the cityscape disappear into the endless night, when he noticed something unusual. There, in the reflection of the window, he saw something, or rather, someone standing behind him. He whipped around, his heart hammering in his chest, but the aisle was empty. Nothing was there. He turned back to the window, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was still there, just out of reach, an indistinct shadow that shifted every time he blinked. A person maybe, or something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this place. The reflection seemed to beckon, and Mark knew, deep down, that he couldn't ignore it. Whatever it was calling him. With a trembling hand, he reached out to the window, pressing his palm against the cool surface. He could feel the sensation of something pressing back, just beyond the glass. A connection, an unspoken understanding, or maybe a warning. Was this it? Mark wondered. Was this the end? And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The reflection was gone, and the window was empty once more. The bus continued its journey, carrying him deeper into the unknown, into the vast, eternal night where there would be no return. Mark sank back into his seat, feeling a strange numbness in his limbs. He closed his eyes, trying to make sense of it all, but no answers came. There was only the endless hum of the bus, the empty streets passing by, and the silence that stretched on forever. Mark had been on the bus for what felt like eternity. But now it wasn't just a bus. It was his home. A home where he would never wake up. A home where he would always be the last passenger, the only one left. The last bus had no end, and Mark, for better or worse, would never get off. The bus continued, its wheels droning against the cracked pavement, its headlights cutting through the thick fog that had started to settle in around the streets. Mark's gaze lingered on the darkened windows, the faint reflection of his own face the only sign of life within the vehicle. The city outside had long since faded into shadows, a realm of gray where nothing seemed real anymore. It was as though the world had become a mere illusion, one that the bus had to drive through endlessly. Mark's fingers drummed on his seat nervously. His heart was no longer racing, but it wasn't calm either. There was a heaviness to the air now, a weight that pressed on his chest. It was as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel around him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bus, the passengers, everything, was part of something far larger than he could understand. The hum of the engine had become hypnotic, and for a brief moment, Mark felt like he might slip away into some kind of trance. He closed his eyes, just for a second, his mind craving some semblance of rest. But as soon as he closed them, the world around him shifted. A strange sound broke through the monotony, the faintest whisper, like a breath or a soft sigh. It was coming from behind him. Mark's eyes snapped open, and he turned slowly, feeling the hairs on his neck stand on end. At first, there was nothing. The aisle remained empty, the seats still vacant. But then, as though from the corners of his vision, he saw it, a shadow. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but it moved with a purpose, sliding across the floor like something that didn't belong. His pulse quickened. Mark could feel the sensation of being watched again, the way the air around him had thickened as if something was drawing near. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head, eyes scanning the aisles for any sign of movement. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again, the shadow. This time, it was unmistakable. It wasn't just a passing movement. It was something deliberate, something intelligent. It was moving toward him. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps. He could see it now, a dark shape, indistinct and flowing, shifting between the seats as though it were made of smoke or mist. It didn't have a definite form, but it was clear enough to know that it wasn't human. The way it moved was unnatural, like a living nightmare. Mark's heart thudded against his ribcage. He didn't know what it was or how it had appeared, but he knew he was no longer alone on this bus. There was something out there, something that had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for him to notice. The figure paused just a few feet away, lingering for a moment as if studying him. Mark's breath hitched in his chest, and he fought the instinct to run, to flee to the door and escape. But there was nowhere to go. The bus was still moving, still carrying him through the void. And the door was locked. Even if he could reach it, there was no guarantee that it would open. It felt as though the bus itself was a trap, and he was stuck in it, caught in its endless journey. He tried to speak, tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. His mouth went dry as the shadow stretched closer, its form flickering and wavering like a mirage. It was almost as though it could feel his fear, drawing strength from it. The air grew colder. Mark's breath came out in visible puffs, and his skin prickled with an eerie chill. He could see the shadow now more clearly, its vague outline swirling like smoke. There was no face, no distinct features, just an impression of movement, like something fluid and formless. But there was something else, something that made his heart race even faster. A sensation of malice, pure, unbridled malice. As the figure reached out, a sharp, sickening crack filled the air. It was as though the bus itself had shifted, as though the world outside the windows had shifted too. Mark looked outside, desperate for any sign of the normal world, but the city had completely disappeared. There was no road, no lights, just a dark, endless void. His gaze snapped back to the shadow. It was standing directly in front of him now, so close that he could feel its cold presence, like a gust of frozen air brushing against his face. His hands shook as he grasped the seat, unwilling to make any movement. The shadow flickered again, its form shifting like liquid. It was reaching for him. No, it was reaching for something inside him, something he couldn't see. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out from sheer terror. The shadow's presence was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't see its eyes, if it even had eyes, but he felt them, felt the weight of its gaze, boring into him. It was like a nightmare, the kind where you're frozen in place, unable to move or scream. He had no way of defending himself, no way of escaping. All he could do was sit there, paralyzed by fear, as the shadow loomed over him, its formless body bending and warping. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. Mark screamed, though it felt like the sound never left his mouth. The world around him seemed to fold in on itself, the bus shaking violently, as though it was going off the rails. The shadow was gone. The eerie sensation vanished. Everything returned to silence. Mark blinked, unsure if it had all been a hallucination. He looked around. The bus was still the same, the seats vacant, the aisle empty. He could see the dim outline of the driver ahead, still guiding the bus through the endless darkness. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had crossed the boundary, something that wasn't supposed to be here. And Mark was terrified to think that maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for him to make the next move. The bus continued its endless journey, its hum a constant drone that echoed through Mark's mind. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow in the corner of his vision, every flicker of movement outside the windows, sent his heart racing. He tried to focus on something, anything, to ground himself in reality. The bus, the dark streets outside, the dull glow of the interior lights. It all felt distant, as if he were trapped in some in-between space where time didn't flow normally. Mark looked around again, his eyes scanning the empty seats. The man at the front of the bus, the one who had been staring at him earlier, had returned to his slumped position. But now Mark noticed something strange. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it had snapped, and his eyes, they were wide open, staring straight ahead, glazed and unblinking. There was no sign of life in them, no movement at all. just cold, empty eyes like glass marbles. His stomach churned, and he quickly looked away, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more the man's stare seemed to burn into him, as if it was a silent, constant reminder that he wasn't alone, and that what was out there, what was in the shadows, was real. He rubbed his temples, willing himself to calm down. He had to keep his composure. The panic was no good. It wasn't helping anything. The bus was moving, wasn't it? It was still moving, still heading down some unknown road. But where was it going? The question lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. Where was this bus headed? And why had he gotten on in the first place? Mark couldn't remember. His thoughts felt foggy, disconnected from reality. He could barely recall how he'd ended up in the seat. Hadn't he been walking home? He remembered walking through the city streets, the cool night air brushing against his skin. But everything after that, it was a blur. A sudden jerk of the bus snapped him back to the present. The lights flickered, dimming for a moment before returning to their sickly glow. Mark looked out the window, his heart lurching as he saw the distorted reflection of himself staring back. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to focus on the street outside. But there was nothing. No city, no buildings, just more fog, swirling and thickening, like the world itself was being swallowed by the darkness. The driver, too, had changed. Mark's gaze flicked to the front of the bus again. The driver's hands were stiffly gripping the wheel, his face a blank mask. His skin had turned pale, the veins under his eyes standing out like dark blue rivers against his flesh. The man didn't blink, didn't move. He was a statue, trapped in the same frozen moment as the passengers around him. And then Mark saw it. At first, it was a subtle shift in the air, a vibration that seemed to pulse through the bus. But then he saw it more clearly, a dark shape, barely visible at the far end of the bus. It was humanoid, but not quite. It was tall, thin, and its limbs seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally with each movement. The figure was moving closer to him, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the shadows, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a passenger. A cold wave of fear washed over Mark. He felt frozen in his seat, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure was getting closer, its footsteps silent but deliberate, as if it were aware of his presence, aware of his fear. The bus jolted again, but this time it didn't stop. It kept moving, slipping deeper into the fog, deeper into the night. The figure was closer now, just a few feet away, its form wavering like a reflection in a cracked mirror. Mark could see its eyes now, if they could even be called eyes. They were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the light from the air around them, leaving nothing but a chilling emptiness. The figure tilted its head, slowly, as though studying him. Mark's throat tightened, but he couldn't look away. He had to know what it was. He had to know if it was real, if it was something he could escape from. But before he could even think of making a move, the figure stepped into the aisle, its long, spindly fingers reaching out toward him. Mark jumped back in his seat, his heart racing as he pressed his back against the cold window. But it didn't matter. The figure was closer now, so close that he could feel its cold presence, like ice seeping through his skin. It reached out, its fingers brushing against his arm. Mark screamed, but the sound didn't come. His mouth moved, but there was no noise, no escape. The figure leaned in, its breath, if it could even be called that, like a cold wind, filling his ears with a whisper. "Where are you going?" it asked. The voice was guttural, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away, from some other dimension. Mark couldn't respond. His mind was too full of terror, too full of questions. Where was the bus going? What was this thing? What did it want? The figure's hand tightened, its fingers digging into his flesh. The pain was sharp, searing, but even as Mark tried to pull away, he couldn't move. The world around him seemed to warp, the bus slipping further and further into the void, the fog consuming everything. He looked to the other passengers, hoping to see someone, anyone who could help. But they were all staring at him, their faces empty, lifeless. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, were filled with the same darkness as the figure, as if they too were part of this nightmare. And then, as if the world was finally collapsing in on itself, the bus lurched violently, throwing Mark to the side. The figure was gone. For a moment, Mark thought he might be dead, trapped in some otherworldly limbo. But then, slowly, he regained control of his senses. He could still feel the cold, though. It clung to him, seeping through his bones. The bus had come to a stop. The doors opened. Mark didn't hesitate. He ran. He didn't know where he was, didn't care. He just needed to get off the bus, away from the thing that had touched him, from the passengers who weren't really passengers. The night air hit him like a slap in the face. He gasped for breath, his legs trembling as he stumbled out into the street. And then in the distance he heard it, the sound of the bus doors closing. It was still there. It was still waiting for him. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he looked around, trying to get his bearings. He had no idea where he was. The street lights flickered above him, casting long shadows on the pavement. There were no other people around, no sign of life, just the distant hum of the city, so far removed from the strange, otherworldly experience he had just endured. The bus, the passengers, the figure, they all felt like a bad dream, a hallucination. But Mark knew better than to doubt his senses. His arm throbbed where the creature had touched him, and he could still feel its cold, clammy grip on his skin, as though it had left a mark on him that wouldn't fade. The bus hadn't just dropped him off in the middle of nowhere. He could see the familiar glow of streetlights a few blocks away. He was close to home. But the thought of going back to his apartment, of stepping back into the familiar world, felt impossible. What if the thing on the bus followed him? What if the bus came for him again? Mark's gaze shot to the street, half expecting the bus to be there, waiting for him. But the street was empty, silent. For a moment, he considered running, just getting away, putting as much distance between himself and the bus as possible. But then the unmistakable sound of a bus engine revving up broke the silence. Mark turned around, his stomach dropping as he saw the headlights of the bus shining through the fog, slowly coming toward him. No, it couldn't be. It couldn't. The bus was back. But how? It had dropped him off, hadn't it? Or had he imagined it all? Mark's legs trembled, and before he could stop himself, he began to run. His footsteps echoed down the empty street, his breath ragged as he tried to outrun the looming bus. The fog seemed to close in around him, swallowing up the world. The glow of the headlights grew brighter and brighter, as though the bus was chasing him, relentlessly pursuing him. With every step he took, the sound of the bus grew louder, closer. He didn't dare turn around. He couldn't bear to see what was following him. He had to get away, had to escape, but the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. The city around him seemed to shift and twist, the streets no longer familiar. He was running in circles, or so it seemed. Nothing made sense anymore. The bus was still there, the engine humming behind him, the lights blinding him. And then, without warning, the bus was there, right in front of him. Mark slammed into it, falling back onto the pavement with a sharp gasp. The bus loomed over him, its doors sliding open. The sound of footsteps rang in his ears, but they weren't the normal footsteps of passengers. They were too heavy, too deliberate. Mark's eyes went wide in horror as a shadow stepped down from the bus. It was the figure from before, its towering form emerging from the fog. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Then it spoke. "You can't escape." The voice was a whisper, but it felt like a scream, like it was inside his head, echoing through his very bones. Mark tried to scramble to his feet, but his limbs wouldn't obey him. He was paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to scream. His eyes stayed locked on the figure, its face a twisted mockery of a human's. The edges of its body blurred in the fog, like it was made of smoke or shadow, a thing that didn't belong to this world. The figure reached out toward him with its long, thin fingers, its movements deliberate, almost sadistic. It took its time, savoring Mark's terror. He felt something shift inside him, an instinct to survive, to fight. With every ounce of willpower he could muster, Mark forced himself to his feet, stumbling backward. He didn't care where he was going now. He didn't care about the bus, about the figure. He just had to keep moving. But as he turned to run, something grabbed his arm. The world seemed to tilt as he was yanked backward, back toward the open doors of the bus. He tried to pull away, to break free, but the grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. His heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. The figure's voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You're already part of it. You always have been." The words slithered into his mind, suffocating him, making him feel like he was drowning in them. He struggled harder, but the more he fought, the more the figure seemed to stretch, to grow, its presence overwhelming him. And then, in a final surge of desperation, Mark did the only thing he could think to do. He screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of defiance, a primal cry for freedom. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. He pushed against the shadowy figure with every ounce of strength left in him. For a moment, it felt like nothing happened. The bus, the fog, the figure, they all seemed to freeze in time. The world held its breath. And then suddenly the figure let go. Mark stumbled forward, gasping for air, his body trembling from the effort. The fog seemed to recede just a little, the streets finally opening up before him. The bus, the shadow, it was all behind him now. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Mark ran, faster than he ever had in his life, through the fog, through the darkness, through the empty streets. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from that bus, from those things, from the nightmare that was still chasing him. And as he ran, the words of the figure echoed in his mind, a warning that wouldn't fade. "You're already part of it." He didn't know what it meant, but he didn't want to find out. The bus was gone. The figure was gone. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had followed him, whatever had been on that bus, was still waiting. Somewhere. Watching. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled down the foggy streets, his legs burning with each step. The rhythmic sound of his footsteps was the only noise that filled the oppressive silence, his body moving on instinct, not entirely sure where he was headed. The city that had once seemed so familiar now felt foreign, alien, as if it had transformed into a maze with no exit. The towering buildings loomed over him like silent, observing giants, their windows dark and hollow. It had been hours. Mark wasn't sure how much time had passed. His phone had died long ago, and the constant buzzing in his mind, the unsettling feeling that something was still out there, had kept him from thinking clearly. His thoughts were a mess, but one thing kept repeating in his mind: "You're already part of it." The words haunted him. They felt like an anchor, pulling him back to the nightmare he had just escaped from. Was it real? Had he imagined the bus, the shadowy figure? He wasn't sure anymore. The more he tried to convince himself it was all just a bad dream, the more the unease gnawed at him. Something about the figure, the way it had spoken, the coldness that radiated from it, didn't sit right with him. It felt like it had been waiting for him, like it knew him. Mark's pace slowed, exhaustion setting in as he stumbled onto a quieter street. The fog was thicker here, swirling around his legs like it had a life of its own. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body, the chill of the night sinking deep into his bones. Suddenly, there was a noise behind him. Mark froze. A low metallic creak, the sound of something heavy being dragged across pavement. He turned slowly, heart pounding in his chest, eyes darting to the shadowy street behind him. The fog swirled, making it impossible to see clearly. But then, there it was, a figure standing just at the edge of the fog, barely visible. Mark's blood ran cold. It was the bus. But how? How was it here? Had he imagined it all? Was this another twisted game the creature was playing with him? He took a step back, then another, but the figure didn't move. The bus was stationary, as if waiting for him, as if it had been there all along, watching him. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then a door opened, the sound cutting through the fog like a knife. "Mark," a voice called, the sound familiar yet distorted. It was deep, gravelly, as if it had been dragged from the very pits of the earth. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice, but it couldn't be. It sounded like his own, like a distorted version of himself. "No," Mark whispered under his breath, shaking his head. He took another step back, but the fog seemed to close in around him. The street was narrowing, the walls of the city looming taller, trapping him. "Come home," the voice continued, the tone too inviting, too familiar. "You're already a part of us." Mark's mind spun. His legs shook beneath him, but he couldn't stop staring at the bus. The doors were open wide now, and in the dim light from the headlights, he could see movement inside. Shadowy figures, the same passengers from before, their faces hidden in the dark, waiting for him. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, but his body felt heavy, like it was being pulled toward the bus, toward the voices, toward the darkness that seemed to promise some twisted kind of belonging. "You're one of us now, Mark. Come with us," the voice coaxed, each word wrapped in an eerie sweetness that made his stomach churn. The fog thickened around him, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. Mark's head swam, his vision blurring at the edges. The world around him seemed to tilt, and for a moment, he felt like he was sinking into the ground. But then, the bus doors slammed shut. The fog lifted just a little, and Mark gasped for breath. The world cleared. The bus was gone. The street was empty. There were no figures, no voices. Just the distant sound of traffic, the familiar hum of the city night. Mark stood there for a moment, disoriented, trying to process what had just happened. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the weight of exhaustion and fear seemed to hit him all at once. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, clutching his chest. He was alone. The bus was gone, the figures were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Something inside Mark told him he hadn't escaped. It wasn't over. Whatever had happened on that bus, whatever had followed him, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The night stretched on, the fog lingering in the streets like a thick, suffocating blanket. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, the bus waited. For him. Mark pushed himself to his feet, his hands trembling as he wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts, desperately trying to piece together what had happened. Was it real? Was he losing his mind? He glanced down the empty street, but all he could see was a haze of fog, creeping up from the ground like a living thing. The world felt off-kilter, unfamiliar in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He took a shaky step forward, then another. The silence around him was unnerving. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard any sound other than his own breathing. Not even the hum of distant cars or the faint chirp of crickets. It was as if the entire city had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something. His footsteps echoed in the quiet as he moved down the street, unsure of where he was headed. His phone was still dead, and there was no way to track how far he'd walked from the bus stop, or if he was even on the same street anymore. The fog seemed to twist, shifting as if it were a living entity, like it was guiding him somewhere. "Focus, Mark," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his thoughts. "You're just tired. It's all in your head. It's just the exhaustion, the stress." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. How could he explain the figures in the bus? How could he explain the distorted voice that had called his name? It was too real, too vivid. There was no way it was just a dream. Suddenly, something in the fog ahead caught his attention. A figure, a person, standing motionless in the distance, barely visible through the thick mist. They were facing away from him, their bodies silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the fog. Mark froze, his pulse quickening. For a moment, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him again, but the figure didn't move. It was too still, too unnaturally quiet. "Hello," Mark called out hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. He took a cautious step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure remained perfectly still, not acknowledging his presence in the slightest. As Mark drew closer, he could make out more details. The person was wearing a long coat, their posture rigid, as if they were waiting. But waiting for what? For whom? "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice a little stronger now, though his anxiety bubbled beneath the surface. No answer. The fog seemed to part slightly as he drew closer, and then, just as he was within arm's reach of the figure, they suddenly turned. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The person's face was pale, almost ghostly white, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to see through him, not at him. Their mouths stretched into a thin, unnatural grin, lips drawn tight against their teeth. It was an expression that was more unsettling than anything Mark had seen in the past hour. It wasn't just creepy, it was wrong, like something had broken in the way they were supposed to look. Mark stumbled back, his feet skidding on the wet pavement. "What the hell?" The figure took a step forward, their movements smooth and eerily deliberate. "You're not supposed to be here," they said, their voice low and cold, devoid of any warmth. Mark's heart thudded painfully in his chest. This wasn't just some random person. This was something else, something that had been waiting for him, just like the figures on the bus. He turned and ran. He didn't care where he was going anymore. He just needed to get away, to escape the suffocating dread that gripped him. But the fog seemed to close in around him, swirling faster, thicker, as if it were actively trying to trap him. Behind him, the figure's footsteps followed, steady and unhurried. They weren't chasing him, they were just walking. And that was what terrified Mark the most. The knowledge that they didn't need to run, that they didn't need to hurry. They were patient. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. His lungs burned as he sprinted down the street, but it felt like no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the fog, couldn't escape the presence of something chasing him. The air grew colder, and he could hear the figure's voice again, faint but clear. "You can't outrun it, Mark. You belong to us." Mark skidded to a stop, his feet slipping beneath him. He turned quickly, looking back over his shoulder. The figure was gone. A wave of relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The fog was still thick, the city around him still eerily silent. He had no idea where he was anymore, or how to get back. His mind raced with questions, and the sense of unease that had been growing inside him now felt like a constant pressure on his chest, squeezing tighter with every passing second. Suddenly, a light flickered through the fog ahead. It wasn't the soft glow of street lamps, but the harsh, almost fluorescent brightness of something unnatural. Mark squinted, trying to make sense of it, but it was too far away. All he could see was a dark shape, blocking the light. And then something else. A bus. The last bus. Mark's stomach churned. He didn't want to approach it. He didn't want to get any closer to it, to whatever it was that had been following him all night. But he couldn't help himself. It was as though the bus was pulling him in, calling him, just like before. The doors opened with a sharp hiss, and a figure stepped out, silhouetted in the doorway. It was the driver. Mark's blood ran cold. It was the same figure from the first bus ride. The same eyes, the same face. This time, even more twisted, more hollow, as though the creature had been waiting for him, patiently all this time. "Come on, Mark," the driver said, its voice a rasping whisper. "You've already missed your stop, but there's always room for one more." Mark's legs gave way beneath him. The fog closed in tighter. The streets blurred. The figure in the doorway waited, its grin widening. And the doors of the bus waited to close. Waiting for him. Waiting for the last passenger to come home. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and erratic. His mind screamed at him to turn and run, to break free from the grasp of whatever force had pulled him into this nightmare. But his legs felt like they were made of stone, unmoving, as if rooted to the ground. The bus doors remained open, as though inviting him in, its interior a dark void that seemed to stretch out endlessly, swallowing the faint light around it. The driver's figure stood motionless in the doorway, its eerie grin never faltering. Mark could feel the weight of its gaze, even though it was impossible to see the full extent of its face. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The compulsion to step forward was too strong. "Get on," the driver rasped, the words slithering into his mind. "You've already been chosen. The journey's not over. You'll never leave now." The fog seemed to thicken further, swirling around him like a living thing, tugging at his feet, urging him toward the bus. Mark took a step back, his body trembling uncontrollably. "No, no, I won't," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible against the cacophony of thoughts racing through his mind. The driver stepped out of the bus, and as it did, the faint light that had illuminated its form seemed to distort, flickering like a broken bulb. Mark saw the shadow behind it, darker than the night itself, as though it was swallowing the light. "You can't escape," the driver muttered, its voice echoing like a distant whisper, growing louder with each word. "You're already inside. There's no getting out." Mark took another step back, but the fog closed in around him, sealing him off from the street. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist like long fingers, creeping closer, enclosing him in a cage of darkness. Desperately, he turned around, but there was nowhere to go. Every direction led back to the bus, to the figure in the doorway, waiting patiently as though the whole world had been reduced to this single moment in time. Mark realized with a sinking feeling that the reality he knew was unraveling at the seams. The city, the streets, the familiar sights, all of it was fading into the fog, consumed by the unnatural presence around him. He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat, strangled by the overwhelming pressure in the air. The driver took another step forward, its form growing more distorted, its body shifting like smoke. Mark could hear the soft scraping of metal behind him. He didn't need to look, he knew what it was. The bus was moving. It had started rolling closer. A flicker of movement caught his eye. From within the bus's windows, he saw them. Figures sitting, standing, staring at him. There was no expression on their faces, just empty eyes fixed on him, unblinking, unseeing. The passengers, the ones who had been there before him, who had been waiting for him. "Come with us," one of the passengers whispered through the fog, its voice not quite human, not quite real. "We're all going to the same place. You can't outrun this." Mark stumbled backward, panic flooding his system as he realized that the entire scene was suffocating him. The fog was no longer just around him. It was inside him, filling his lungs, pressing down on his chest. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse from the sheer weight of it all. But then, from the darkness, something else began to take shape. A new figure, a shadow darker than the rest, standing at the back of the bus, watching him. This one was different. It was tall, its features hidden in the deep blackness that surrounded it, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were glowing faintly, a soft red that flickered with an unnatural light. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The figure's presence sent a shiver down his spine, its silent gaze locking onto him as if it were seeing straight through him. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there watching, waiting. It was the final piece in the puzzle. Mark realized then, with a sudden and terrible clarity, that there was no escape. He wasn't meant to leave this place. He was meant to join them. The doors of the bus creaked open wider, and the driver's grin stretched further, its features warping in the fog. "Step aboard," it beckoned, the words wrapping around Mark's mind like a vice. Mark's body moved against his will, one foot in front of the other, as if some invisible force was guiding him forward. He didn't want to move, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't fight it anymore. As he stepped toward the bus, a cold gust of wind swept through the air, and for just a second, Mark felt something, a fleeting thought, a sensation, that told him there was something more. Something beyond the fog, beyond the bus, beyond the empty street. But it was too late. The doors closed behind him with a finality that shook him to the core. He was inside, and now he could see the passengers more clearly, their eyes all fixed on him, their hollow gazes unblinking, unfeeling. They weren't human. Not anymore. None of them were. The bus began to move again, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The city outside blurred, turning into streaks of light and shadows. Mark could hear the faint murmurs of the passengers, their voices low and strange, indistinct but urgent. There was something in the air, something that made his skin crawl. The figure at the back of the bus remained still, its glowing eyes never leaving him. And then, as the bus hurtled deeper into the unknown, Mark realized what the driver had meant. The journey wasn't over. It had just begun. The last bus home was taking him somewhere else. Somewhere far, far beyond the city. Far beyond anything he had ever known. And now, there was no going back. As the bus sped through the fog, Mark tried to shake off the heavy, suffocating feeling that clung to him. The passengers around him didn't move, didn't speak. Only their eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking, unfeeling. Their expressions were emotionless, hollow, as if they had long ago ceased to be human. His mind screamed for him to wake up, to shake off whatever nightmare he had fallen into. But his body felt as though it was no longer his own. He was trapped in this bus, surrounded by the oppressive darkness that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. The figure at the back of the bus, tall, shadowed, its glowing red eyes, remained motionless, but Mark could feel it watching him. He could feel the weight of its gaze on him, like an invisible hand pressing against his chest. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it sent a chill down Mark's spine. "Welcome aboard." The voice was smooth, almost pleasant, but there was something chilling about it. Mark turned, looking around, but no one else had moved. The passengers remained in their seats, silent and still, their eyes fixed forward, or on him, or maybe on nothing at all. It was the driver. Mark didn't need to look up to know. The voice had come from the front of the bus. The driver was speaking to him, and Mark could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This was no ordinary bus ride. "We've been waiting for you," the driver continued, its voice somehow closer now, as if it was right beside him. The others, they've all come before you. And now it's your turn. Mark's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. His eyes darted around the bus, but all he could see were the passengers, their eyes unwavering, their faces hollow and lifeless. Their very presence was suffocating. "Who are you?" Mark managed to choke out, his voice barely more than a whisper. The driver didn't respond immediately. Instead, there was a low chuckle, dark and unsettling, that echoed throughout the bus. Then, the driver's voice broke the silence again, softer now, almost coaxing. "You already know who we are." The words sent a shiver down Mark's spine, and his breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand, not fully. He hadn't asked for any of this. This wasn't his world. This wasn't where he belonged. Yet, it felt like it was happening, as if it had always been happening, just beneath the surface of his everyday life. He felt a cold hand brush against his arm. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was nothing there. No one had moved. No one had touched him. But the sensation lingered, the coldness sinking into his bones. He looked at the figure in the back of the bus again. The glowing red eyes were still there, fixed on him. It hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. But Mark knew it was waiting for something. The bus began to slow, its creaking wheels grinding against the pavement as it came to a stop. Mark could hear the screech of the brakes, the sudden silence of the motionless vehicle. He hadn't realized they had been moving so quickly, but now the stillness felt unnatural, like the calm before the storm. Outside the bus, the city had disappeared entirely. There were no buildings, no streetlights, no familiar landmarks. Just an endless, stretching darkness. The windows of the bus were no longer transparent, just black, as if the very air outside had swallowed up everything in its path. "Where are we?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. The driver didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, it spoke, its voice heavy with an eerie calm. "We're where you'll always be. Where we all are. It's just a matter of time before you understand." Mark's mind spun, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't want to understand. He didn't want to know. But he could feel it, creeping at the edges of his thoughts. This place, wherever it was not meant for him. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The figure at the back of the bus began to move then, its form slowly shifting, stretching out of the shadows like a dark cloud, twisting in unnatural ways. Mark couldn't look away. It moved toward him, its red eyes burning into his soul. Its presence suffocated the air around him. One of the passengers turned its head, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Its lips twisted into a grotesque grin, its eyes never leaving Mark. The darkness pressed in closer, the fog thickening around them. Mark felt the air grow cold, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill. He shivered, but there was no escape. He turned toward the door, but it was already too late. The doors had closed. They had been closed the moment the bus started moving. He was trapped. "Get off," a voice hissed from the back of the bus. Mark turned toward the voice, but all he saw was the figure, now standing just inches from him. The air felt impossibly cold, the stench of rot and decay hanging in the space between them. The figure's face remained hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowed brighter now, almost blinding in their intensity. "Get off," the voice repeated, louder this time, as if it was speaking directly into his mind. Mark's body felt heavy, his limbs sluggish, as if they were made of lead. His mind screamed for him to do something, anything, but his body refused to obey. He was being pulled into the darkness, into the abyss that surrounded the bus. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at him. Mark felt the air tighten, suffocating him, choking the very life from his lungs. "Get off," it demanded, its voice now a growl. And then, everything went dark. The bus, the passengers, the figure, they all vanished into the blackness. Mark's heart beat in his ears as he realized he was no longer on the bus. He was standing in the middle of the street, alone. The fog had lifted, and the city was back. The street lights flickered overhead, casting long, stretching shadows. He was back where it had all started, but he knew deep down that this was just the beginning. The coldness that had enveloped him on the bus lingered in the air, even as he stood on the familiar street corner. His heart pounded against his chest, and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The world around him seemed unchanged, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something had followed him. He turned around, searching the empty street, but there was no sign of the bus, no sign of the passengers, nothing out of the ordinary. The usual sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people filled the air. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Mark glanced at his watch, but the time was off. It was earlier than it should have been. Hours had passed since the bus ride. At least that's what he had thought. But it felt like it had all happened just moments ago. The strange figure, the hollow-eyed passengers, the suffocating dark, and the voice that had come from the driver. He reached out to touch the nearest streetlight for something familiar to ground him. But as his fingers brushed the cold metal pole, a sudden sense of dread swept over him. His hand jerked back. His eyes darted to the sidewalk, where a shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long. No one was around. The streets were empty, but there was something about the shadows, they weren't right. For the first time, Mark began to notice subtle changes. The windows of the buildings nearby seemed to flicker, as if the lights inside were dimming and then brightening in quick succession. The sounds of the city now seemed muffled, distant, as if he were hearing everything from beneath the surface of a deep, murky water. A crackling noise sounded behind him, and Mark whipped around, his breath caught in his throat. But there was nothing, just empty streets, the same as before. His legs trembled, and for a moment he considered running away from whatever dark force had been following him. But where could he go? He had no idea, no direction. He couldn't even remember how he had gotten here, how long he had been walking. A gust of wind swept through the street, carrying with it a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Not done yet. Mark froze. His blood ran cold. The voice was back. He whirled around again, searching for the source, but there was nothing. No one. But then he noticed something. Across the street, standing under the flickering streetlight, was a figure. Its outline was obscured by the darkness, but Mark could see its shape clearly enough. Tall, lean. The faint glow of red eyes burned through the shadows, locking onto him. The voice came again, echoing in his mind, close but distant at the same time. "You didn't think you could escape, did you?" Mark stumbled back, his heart racing, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him. He took a step forward, his legs shaking beneath him. His mind screamed for him to run, to get away, but he couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the glowing red orbs that seemed to pierce through the night. A chill ran down his spine as the air grew even colder. The figure's form seemed to stretch, its shadow warping unnaturally. It was as if it wasn't quite part of this world, as if it existed in the cracks between reality and something far darker. Mark's breathing quickened. His thoughts raced. What was it? Why was it following him? A movement in the corner of his vision caught his attention. Another figure, this time closer. A woman, standing in a doorway, her head tilted at an odd angle. Her eyes, too, glowed an unnatural red like the others. Mark's mind was spinning. There was no escape. He had seen the passengers on the bus. He had seen their hollow eyes. But now it was all around him. The woman in the doorway didn't speak, but Mark could feel her gaze. It was pulling him in like gravity, like the pull of a vortex he could neither fight nor resist. "Leave him alone," Mark shouted, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not staying here." The woman's mouth opened, revealing a twisted, jagged grin that spread unnaturally wide. Her teeth were sharp, impossibly sharp, like rows of glass shards. "Too late for that," she whispered. The sound of her voice felt like it was inside his head. Suddenly, the street around him seemed to vanish, the buildings melting into the air like smoke. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the world around him twisted, contorting into shapes that defied logic, as if the city itself was unraveling. Mark stumbled backward, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. "Get off the bus," a voice rasped, far too close, sending a jolt of terror down his spine. He spun around to see the driver from the bus standing there, right behind him. But this time, it wasn't a simple figure behind the wheel. It was a grotesque, twisted version of itself. Its face was cracked, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, the skin pulling and peeling as if it were not meant to exist in this world. And then Mark understood. This wasn't the city he knew anymore. This wasn't the world he had once lived in. This was their world now, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, between human and something much darker, had been torn apart. The air turned thick with a malevolent presence, and Mark's heart raced faster than ever. The ground seemed to collapse beneath him, the world tilting, the night stretching into an endless abyss. And in that final moment, as the voices and shadows closed in around him, Mark realized there was no way out. There had never been any way out. He had taken the last bus home, and it had led him here, to the edge of something far worse than he could ever imagine. The dark void around Mark seemed to press in on him from all sides. The ground had ceased to exist beneath his feet, and the walls of reality were bending and shifting, forming strange, distorted shapes. The figures, the ones he had seen on the bus, were everywhere now, their glowing red eyes fixated on him, their twisted forms blending into the very fabric of the place. A cold wind began to howl through the emptiness, carrying with it the faint echoes of laughter, hollow and cruel. Mark's skin prickled as if something was crawling beneath it. He staggered back, the feeling of being surrounded growing stronger with every passing second. "Did you really think you could escape?" The voice was everywhere, in his head, in the air around him, in the very ground beneath his feet. It was the voice of the bus driver, now distorted and ragged like a broken radio. "You've already stepped into our world, Mark. You're not leaving." Mark tried to move, to run, but his body felt frozen, his legs unwilling to obey. The shadows seemed to reach out, grasping at him, pulling him in, their cold fingers sinking into his skin like ice. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His chest constricted, suffocating him, as the figures drew closer. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light pierced the darkness. Mark shielded his eyes, but the light didn't fade. It grew stronger, brighter, until the very air around him crackled with energy. The ground trembled beneath him as a low, resonating hum filled the space, vibrating through his bones. The shadows recoiled, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw a figure standing in the light. The figure stepped forward, tall and imposing. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Mark could feel its presence like a force of nature, something ancient and powerful. It reached out a hand, and the shadows around Mark flinched, retreating into the corners. "You shouldn't have boarded that bus," the figure said, its voice calm, yet with an unsettling authority. "You've crossed into a place that exists outside time and space, a place between worlds." Mark didn't know what to say. He was too scared to speak, too terrified to even move. The figure's voice softened, but there was a hint of sorrow in it now. But not all is lost. There is still a way out. If you wish to return, you must make a choice. Mark looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. A choice? What choice? The figure's hand gestured toward the dark, swirling mass of shadows that surrounded him. You must choose whether to remain in this place or return to your own world. But know this, if you choose to return, you will forget everything. The bus, the passengers, this place, it will all be erased from your memory. You will live your life as if nothing ever happened. Mark's mind raced. He wanted to return to his old life, to forget all of this, to forget the horror he had experienced. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The figure seemed too calm, too certain of its power. And if he chose to forget, would he be truly free? Or would he simply be trapped in a cycle, destined to relive the same nightmare over and over again? What happens if I stay? Mark asked, his voice shaky. The figure's face remained hidden in shadow, but Mark could feel its eyes on him, burning through the darkness. If you stay, you will become one of us. You will walk the line between worlds, neither truly alive nor truly dead. You will be a part of this place, forever. Mark felt his pulse quicken. He didn't want that. He didn't want to be trapped in this nightmare forever. But was he willing to forget? Was he willing to erase everything he had seen and felt, just to return to a normal life? The decision weighed heavily on him. He closed his eyes, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Could he really live with the knowledge of what had happened? Could he live with the idea that the world he knew wasn't the only one? In that moment, Mark realized something. It wasn't just about escaping. It was about accepting that reality was more complicated than he had ever imagined. The figure, the shadows, the bus, it was all part of a greater web, something he couldn't escape simply by choosing one path over the other. There was no clean resolution, no easy escape. Whatever he decided, his life would never be the same. Finally, Mark took a deep breath. He opened his eyes and met the figure's gaze. "I choose to return," he said, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped his heart. The figure nodded, its expression unreadable. "So be it." In the blink of an eye, the light around him intensified, blinding him completely. The darkness receded, and the shadows melted away. Mark felt a pull, a tug at his very soul, as if he was being torn away from this place. The air around him grew heavier, then lighter, until finally, everything went still. When Mark opened his eyes again, he was standing at the bus stop. The city around him was quiet, the night peaceful. The streetlights flickered softly in the distance. The familiar hum of traffic filled the air. It was as if nothing had changed. But as Mark glanced down at his watch, he saw the time. It was earlier than it should have been. He should have already been home. Shouldn't he have gotten off the bus by now? He turned toward the street, his heart racing, and saw the familiar silhouette of the bus approaching in the distance. But there was something different about it now. The lights, though bright, seemed strangely dim. The sound of the engine was low, almost like a growl. Mark hesitated. Should he get on? He glanced around, but the street was empty. No one was watching. No one was there. And then he saw it. A faint reflection in the window of the bus. A shadow of something standing in the back. Its eyes were glowing red, staring straight at him. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The decision had never truly been his to make. He stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The bus approached, its headlights glaring into the dark night, casting long shadows across the empty street. Mark's feet felt like they were stuck to the pavement, his body unwilling to move despite the overwhelming sense of dread that was growing within him. He didn't want to get on that bus. He didn't want to see what awaited him inside. But as the bus came closer, something strange happened. The figure, No, the shadow moved, shifting inside the bus window. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was real, tangible, and it was beckoning him. The voice from earlier echoed in his mind, a whisper that felt like it came from inside his skull. You've already made your choice. There's no going back now. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to run, to turn and flee from whatever this was, but his legs felt as though they were anchored in place. The street around him had grown unnaturally silent. The sound of the bus's engine was the only thing he could hear now, throbbing like a heartbeat in the darkness. The doors of the bus opened with a slow, ominous creak, and the figure inside remained still, its glowing eyes locked onto Mark's. It was like it was waiting for him to step forward, to join it in the darkness. The bus was empty, save for that one figure. No other passengers, no sign of life. Only the shadow watching. Mark felt the chill of the night air seep into his bones. He didn't want to get on that bus. He had seen what it could do. He had felt it. The darkness. The pull of the otherworldly. He had barely escaped the first time, but now it seemed like it was too late. In a moment of sheer panic, he turned and bolted, his legs finally obeying the command to run. His breath was ragged, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. He could feel the weight of the shadow following him, but he didn't dare look back. Don't look back, he told himself. Just run. He rounded a corner, his heart hammering in his chest, the sound of the bus fading behind him. He turned another corner, then another, until he was running through alleyways and side streets, the cold night air rushing past him. But even as he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind him, closing the gap, waiting for him to falter. It felt like hours before Mark finally stopped, bent over, gasping for breath in an unfamiliar alley. He glanced around, his wide eyes searching for any sign of the bus or the shadow, but the street was empty. The silence was deafening. He had lost it, for now. But then, in the distance, he saw it. The faint glow of headlights. The rumble of the bus's engine. It was coming for him again. This time, there was no escape. Mark turned and ran once more, but no matter how far he went, the bus was always just a few steps behind, always close enough to see, always too far to outrun. The streets twisted and turned in impossible ways, distorting in a maddening spiral that made no sense. The night became endless, and the bus kept chasing him. And the shadow, it was always watching, always waiting. It was the last bus. The bus that never stopped, never let go. It had claimed him, and now there was no way off. Mark knew deep down that he would never see his home again. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he tried to go, the bus would always be there, waiting for him. The passengers would always be there, waiting for him to join them in the endless loop of the last ride. The streets had become his prison. The bus his fate. The shadow his constant companion. And as Mark continued to run, he realized the truth. He was never meant to get off. Not this time. Not ever. As Mark's breath became more labored, the pounding in his chest matched the rhythm of the bus's engine. The faint glow of its headlights grew closer, yet no matter how fast he ran, no matter how many twists and turns he made through the maze of alleyways, the shadowy figure remained within his reach, always just a few steps behind. The city had transformed. The familiar buildings, the streets he'd walked down 100 times before, had all melded into a nightmarish version of themselves. The shadows in the alleyways stretched and warped unnaturally, like dark, elongated fingers reaching for him. The familiar hum of distant traffic had been replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. The glow from the bus now felt like the only real thing in this warped world, and even it felt wrong. He darted through an alleyway that had once led to his favorite diner. The neon lights of the restaurant should have illuminated the path, but the bulbs were broken, leaving only flickers of light, like ghosts of the past. A chill settled into his spine. He could hear the unmistakable sound of the bus pulling closer. The screech of its tires scraping against the road filled the void, causing his body to freeze in fear. He glanced behind him. There it was, the bus. The doors slid open with the same ominous creak he had heard earlier, as if the bus itself was inviting him to step on. But this time, it wasn't just the figure inside he could see. There were more. Figures. Shadows. And they were all staring at him, their faces a grotesque blend of people and things he couldn't quite identify. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, hollow and dead, as if their very existence was tied to something far darker than the world he knew. Their mouths hung open, as if waiting to speak, but no words escaped them. Just a cold, suffocating silence. Mark's legs trembled. His pulse thudded in his ears. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. He couldn't move. The bus waited, patient, persistent. "Get on," a voice whispered in the wind. It was soft, but somehow it felt like it was coming from all around him. "You're already part of the ride." The darkness around him pressed in, suffocating him, as if the world was shrinking. The air grew colder, and the distant sound of the city faded into a thin, unrecognizable hum. And then the realization hit him. The bus. The shadow. The people on the bus. They weren't just passengers. They were trapped like him. Mark's mind raced. Was he meant to join them? To become one of the hollow-eyed figures staring out from the bus's window? Was this his fate? To board the last bus and never return? Were they all once like him, normal people who had taken this bus and never seen daylight again? As his thoughts spiraled, the bus's engine rumbled louder, filling his mind, drowning out every other sound. The doors opened wider, inviting him in with an almost familial warmth, the light from inside beckoning. Mark's legs no longer obeyed his commands. His body felt like it was being pulled, gently but inexorably, toward the bus. The street seemed to tilt under him, as if the ground itself was shifting, becoming something alien. "No!" Mark screamed, but his voice sounded hollow, distant. His words dissolved into the air, like they had never been spoken at all. He felt his feet move forward, drawn toward the bus like a magnet. He couldn't resist. He couldn't fight it. The air felt thick with dread, pressing down on him like an oppressive weight. His heart hammered in his chest, but every step forward seemed to drain the last of his will. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of his name. Mark. It was a whisper so soft, so faint that he wasn't sure if it was real. But then it came again. Mark. His heart stopped. His eyes widened, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The voice was too familiar, too close. It wasn't coming from the bus. It was coming from behind him. Mark turned slowly, his body unwilling to listen to his mind's command to flee. The street had changed again. It was no longer the place he'd known. The buildings seemed to loom over him, dark and oppressive. The shadows were alive, twisting, crawling toward him. The world around him was folding in on itself, a spiraling vortex that left him standing at the edge of reality, looking into an abyss. And standing in the center of the street, in the dim light of the distant street lamp, was the figure. It was him, a version of himself, pale, eyes wide and glassy, his expression frozen in a perpetual stare of emptiness. His clothes were tattered and torn, as if worn down by years of decay. The figure stood motionless, watching him, its mouth slightly agape, as though it was waiting for Mark to speak. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His skin crawled. The figure's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. "Join us," the figure whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The word sent a shock through his body. His heart seemed to stop, a wave of terror crashing over him. No, he couldn't. Not like this. Not with them. The world spun around him as the figure took a step forward. It was like time itself had frozen, and yet the figure moved with a strange grace, gliding toward him without making a sound. Mark's body refused to move. His feet were cemented to the ground, as though gravity itself was betraying him. "Join us." The words rang in his ears, louder now, all around him, a cacophony of whispers, each one more frantic than the last. The bus's engine roared to life again, drowning out everything but the rising crescendo of voices, beckoning him, pulling him toward the end of the road. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. His reflection in the figure's eyes, his own face, but warped and empty, seemed to stare back at him, offering no escape. And yet, deep within him, he knew the truth. He had been on this path all along. Mark turned toward the bus one final time, knowing there was no turning back. He had reached the end of the line. Mark took a step forward, his legs moving of their own accord, the voice that had once screamed for him to stop now a distant memory. The cold air from the bus seemed to envelop him, drawing him closer. The shadowy figures within the vehicle shifted, their hollow eyes following his every move. As he neared the door, it slid open, welcoming him with an eerie, almost comforting sound. The darkness inside the bus felt alive, pulsating, as if it was breathing along with him. Each step he took felt like a step deeper into an unknown abyss, his body moving on autopilot, his mind screaming for him to turn back, but no longer able to command his limbs. The doors clicked shut behind him with a finality that sent a tremor through his spine. The air inside was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. He stood frozen at the entrance, his eyes scanning the bus, the passengers' faces like reflections in a broken mirror, familiar and foreign all at once. One of the figures, a tall man with gaunt features, moved slightly in his seat, his eyes never leaving Mark. The figure's lips parted in a slow, deliberate smile, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white against the unnatural pallor of his skin. Mark's stomach churned, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. His heartbeat drummed in his ears, drowning out the faint hum of the bus's engine. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to comprehend what was happening, the crushing weight of the realization settling over him like a dark fog. "You're one of them now." The thought sliced through his mind like a knife, cold and unfeeling. There was no escape, no way to turn back. He had crossed the threshold, and now he was bound to this place, this bus, this thing. He stumbled toward an empty seat, his body fighting the urge to flee, to escape, but there was nowhere to run. He collapsed into the seat, his eyes drawn to the faces around him, the grotesque figures who had once been human, just like him. The more he looked, the more they seemed to shift, to blur at the edges, their faces warping like wax melting in the heat of a fire. The bus began to move, its wheels groaning against the pavement as it pulled away from the stop. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the lights outside flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls of the bus. He glanced around nervously, his eyes darting to the windows, but all he could see were the dark streets, stretching on endlessly, the cityscape slowly fading into nothingness. The bus was no longer moving through the familiar streets of the city. The buildings outside had become twisted and foreign, the streets narrower, the shadows longer. The familiar landmarks, the neon lights, the hum of life, everything was gone, replaced by a sprawling void. The passengers on the bus remained still, their faces expressionless, their eyes empty, locked onto nothing in particular. The man who had smiled at him earlier now sat motionless, his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for something. Mark felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to speak, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. His throat tightened, as if something were blocking his voice, choking it back. He wanted to scream, to ask what was happening, but the words stuck in his chest, weighed down by an unseen force. And then, the bus began to slow. The darkness outside deepened, the streets vanishing into the blackness as though the world was being consumed by the night itself. The only sound now was the slow, rhythmic hum of the bus's engine, lulling Mark into a sense of dread that seemed to grow with every passing second. The bus came to a stop, the screech of the tires echoing through the silence. Mark blinked, shaking his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He looked out the window, but there was nothing. No city, no street, only an endless black void stretching before him. A voice, soft and whispering, barely audible, sounded from somewhere behind him. "Welcome," it said. The voice was familiar, yet unrecognizable. "You've made it. We've all been waiting." Mark turned sharply, but the figure behind him was gone. His pulse quickened. He felt a sudden, desperate need to get off the bus, to escape whatever twisted fate awaited him. But when he looked up, the doors had disappeared. There was no exit, no escape. The passengers around him began to stir, their eyes slowly shifting toward him. It was as if they were waking from a deep sleep, their gaze sharpening as they all focused on him, their smiles widening in unison. Their faces twisted in a grotesque imitation of humanity, like masks peeling away to reveal something far darker underneath. The man who had smiled at him earlier leaned forward, his face inches from Mark's. His breath smelled of rot, his lips twitching with a disturbing grin. "You'll learn soon enough," the man whispered, his voice low and raspy. "We're all part of the ride now. All of us." The words sent a shiver down Mark's spine, but before he could respond, the bus lurched forward again, the darkness outside closing in as the vehicle sped through the void. The faces around him became more blurred, the shadows more intense, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears as the world around him seemed to warp and twist. He had entered the bus, but now it felt like there was no way out, no way to return to the life he once knew. He was trapped in this twisted realm, bound to this endless ride, with no end in sight. And as the bus drove deeper into the darkness, Mark realized the horrifying truth. There would be no last stop, no way home. The ride had only just begun. The world outside the bus had long since disappeared, swallowed whole by the oppressive darkness that enveloped them. There was no longer any sense of direction, no sense of time. The bus moved like a phantom, gliding through the void, the hum of its engine the only sound to break the silence. Mark's heart raced, his breath shallow as he gripped the seat in front of him. His mind spun with confusion, fear, and a desperate need to understand what was happening. Who were these people, these things that rode with him? And why had they chosen him? The passengers remained still, their eyes locked onto him, unblinking. There was no movement, no sound from them, just that awful, suffocating presence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Mark tried to look away, but their gazes burned into him, making him feel like he was being pulled apart from the inside. Then, as if sensing his rising panic, one of the passengers spoke, a woman, her voice soft, almost melodic. "You're not the first, you know," she said, her voice carrying a strange, haunting quality. "We've all been here before, just like you." Mark's skin crawled as her words sank in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to demand answers, but the words were lost in his throat, caught in the same unseen force that had kept him silent for so long. The woman's eyes gleamed, her smile widening. "You're part of the ride now," she continued, her tone almost playful. "You can't leave. None of us can. A cold sweat broke out across Mark's forehead as he realized the horror of her words. This wasn't just a bus. It wasn't just a ride. It was something far worse, a trap, a prison, and he was now a part of it, just like the others. As if on cue, the other passengers began to speak in unison, their voices low, hypnotic, like a chant. We're all the same. We're all part of the ride. We can't escape. Mark's mind reeled, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to get off this bus. He had to find a way out. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the door, but there was no handle. No way to open it. His fingers slid uselessly over the smooth surface, as if the bus itself was alive, keeping him trapped inside. Panic surged through him, and he spun around, desperate for a way to escape. But the passengers had begun to move, slowly, deliberately, their eyes locked on him as they began to rise from their seats. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. Mark stumbled backward, his heart racing. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Why am I here? What is this?" The woman with the haunting smile stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with something dark and ancient. "You were chosen," she said, her voice like a whisper in his ear. Just like the rest of us. Mark's breath hitched as the realization hit him like a physical blow. Chosen. He had been chosen for this ride, this endless journey. He had been dragged into this nightmare, just like all the others, and now there was no way out. The bus began to slow again, its wheels creaking as it ground to a halt. Mark's eyes darted to the windows, but all he could see was blackness, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. There was no street, no sky, no city, just a vast, unending void. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw a faint light in the distance, just beyond the threshold. He didn't know if it was real or if it was some cruel illusion, but it was all he had. He was desperate enough to try. He rushed to the door, his hands slamming against the cold metal as he pushed with all his might. The door didn't budge. His heart sank, and he let out a strangled cry of frustration. No, no! The passengers were closing in on him now, their eyes fixed on him with that same predatory gleam. The woman with the smile stood closest, her face now twisted in something darker, something far more sinister. "You're one of us now," she said softly, her voice dripping with malice. "You'll never escape." The words echoed in Mark's mind as the bus began to move again, the darkness pressing in around him, suffocating him, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the bus stopped again. This time, the doors opened to reveal nothing but an endless abyss, a black void that seemed to stretch on forever, a place where time and space had no meaning. Mark stepped forward, his feet moving of their own accord. He didn't know why. His body felt detached, as if it was no longer his. The passengers were waiting, their eyes fixed on him, urging him forward. He could hear their whispers now, growing louder, as if they were speaking directly into his mind. "You're one of us. Forever. You can never leave." Mark's legs moved faster, faster than he could control, dragging him toward the edge of the bus, toward the void. His chest tightened as he felt himself being pulled forward, like an invisible force was yanking him into the darkness. The last thing he saw before he stepped into the abyss was the woman's smile, wide and cruel, her eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as pure malice. And then there was nothing. No bus, no passengers, no world, just darkness, eternal, unyielding darkness. Mark had become one of them. The darkness enveloped him, suffocating, all-consuming. There were no walls, no ceiling, no ground beneath his feet. It was as though he was suspended in a void, caught between dimensions, a place where time had no meaning. The only sensation that remained was the echo of his heartbeat, thumping in his chest like a drum, reverberating through the infinite expanse. Mark couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His mind swam in a haze of panic, confusion, and despair. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void, absorbed by the nothingness around him. It was as if the universe had closed its ears to his cries. His body felt heavy, as though it were being pulled deeper into the darkness, but there was no direction, no up or down, just the endless, oppressive weight of being lost. Then, without warning, the whispers began. Soft at first, like a distant murmur, the voices slowly grew louder, their words a mixture of unintelligible mumblings and jagged sentences. Mark's heart raced, and he could feel his chest tightening as the whispers grew closer. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as if the voices themselves were suffocating him, pressing in on him from all sides. He tried to shut them out, to block them out of his mind, but the more he fought, the louder they became. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, cruel, full of an ancient, malicious glee. The voices seemed to seep into his skin, into his very bones, filling him with a cold, gnawing dread that made his flesh crawl. And then, a voice broke through the chaos. It was familiar, too familiar. "You shouldn't have gotten on that bus." Mark froze. The words struck him like a physical blow, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't need to look to know who had spoken. He already knew. The woman, the one with the haunting smile, the one who had greeted him on the bus, whose eyes had followed him, whose voice had haunted him. She was here, in this place with him, just beyond his reach, her presence a weight in the air. "You're just like us now," she continued, her voice soft, almost tender, like a mother speaking to a child. But there was nothing gentle about her words. They carried a promise of something far worse, something eternal. "We'll never leave, and neither will you." Mark wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body was paralyzed, his mouth dry. The void around him seemed to tighten, the whispers melding into a cacophony of voices, all chanting in unison. "You'll never leave. You'll never leave. You'll never leave." The words repeated endlessly, their meaning seeping into Mark's consciousness like a poison. It was true. He couldn't leave. He had never been meant to leave. The bus had been a trap, a gateway to this nightmare, and now he was bound to it, just like the others. He had become one of them, lost in the endless cycle of the ride, unable to escape, unable to break free. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and yet Mark could feel himself moving, dragged forward by an unseen force. He was falling into something worse than the darkness itself. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it pulling at him, tugging at the very core of his being. The whispers grew louder, louder still, until they filled his ears, his mind, his soul. And then, with a sudden jolt, the world shifted. Mark gasped for air, his lungs burning, and he opened his eyes. He was back on the bus. The familiar hum of the engine surrounded him, the dim lights flickering overhead. The passengers were all around him, as they had been before. But this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. The bus seemed darker, its walls closing in, the passengers' eyes fixed on him once again. And the woman, the one with the haunting smile, was sitting across from him. Her eyes gleamed, a twisted satisfaction in their depths, as if she knew exactly what had happened, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. "You're home," she whispered, her voice a low murmur, barely audible over the hum of the bus. "You'll never leave now. You'll never escape this ride." Mark's heart sank, and he knew deep in his bones that she was right. He had never left. The ride had only just begun. The bus jolted forward, its tires screeching against the road. The familiar sights of the street outside passed by in a blur, as if they were moving too fast for Mark to properly comprehend. But he knew they weren't really moving forward. They were stuck, trapped in a loop, an endless cycle of dark roads and dim streetlights, with no beginning and no end. Just like the passengers on the bus, Mark had become part of the scenery, a shadow in a world that didn't quite make sense. He looked around. The passengers, each one had the same vacant expression on their face, their eyes hollow and distant. None of them acknowledged him, not even the woman. Their presence was more like an echo, their movements mechanical, as if they were on autopilot. He tried to speak, to ask one of them if they knew what was happening, but his voice was drowned out by the hum of the engine. Mark's thoughts swirled in confusion. His mind was a haze of terror, the sharp edges of his panic blurring with the quiet numbness that was starting to take over. He could feel something cold and slick creeping into his thoughts, wrapping itself around his consciousness like a shroud. The whispers, too, were never far from his ears, their voices growing louder and more insistent, repeating the same chant over and over again. "You're not leaving. You're one of us now. You'll never leave." He could barely breathe. The words stung, a constant reminder that he was no longer the man he had been before the bus ride. He was something else now, something that didn't belong to the real world. Mark could feel himself slipping further away from his old self, like he was fading into something else, something darker. The woman, with her empty eyes and cruel smile, was staring at him once more. Her gaze was unwavering, and she leaned closer, her face inches from his. Her breath was cold against his skin, and Mark could see the faintest trace of her teeth, sharp and jagged, glistening in the dim light of the bus. She opened her mouth, and her voice spilled out in a low, mocking tone. "We were all chosen, Mark," she said, her words dripping with malicious delight. "We were chosen to ride, chosen to stay. There's no escaping once you're here. This bus is our home, and you'll never, ever leave." Her words sent a chill down Mark's spine, and for a moment, he felt his heart skip a beat. He wanted to scream, to fight, to tear away from the suffocating presence that surrounded him. But no matter how hard he tried, his body wouldn't respond. He couldn't move. His limbs felt heavy, his mind sluggish, as if the darkness had wrapped itself around him like chains, keeping him tethered to the bus and to the others. A thought flickered through his mind. Perhaps there was a way out, a way to break free. But before he could entertain the idea, the woman's voice broke through again, louder this time, as if she were reading his thoughts. "There is no escape, Mark. Not for you. Not for anyone who rides this bus. Once you're on, you're part of it. Part of us." The words sent a shock through him, a jolt of panic that burned through the fog in his mind. The passengers, too, began to stir, their heads tilted in unison, all eyes turning toward him. They moved as one, their bodies jerking forward as if they were all waiting for something, waiting for him to make a move. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears, the suffocating weight of the air in the bus pressing down on him. The whispers were louder now, a chaotic mess of voices, all speaking in strange tongues, overlapping and blending into one another. He couldn't understand them, but the urgency in their tone made his skin crawl. The bus jerked again, this time harder than before. The road outside grew darker, the lights outside flickering in and out of existence. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, becoming darker, more sinister with each passing second. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. He reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the bus itself had sealed him inside, trapping him with the others who were now staring at him with blank, empty eyes. He pulled harder, but the door remained unmoving, as though it had never been meant to open. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the passengers, a man who had been sitting quietly in the back, his face obscured by a hat, stood up. His body moved unnaturally, stiff and jerky, as if he were no longer in control of his own movements. He turned toward Mark, and for the first time Mark saw his eyes. They were hollow, dark, the irises completely gone, replaced by an empty void. The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile that was human. It was something grotesque, twisted, a grin that stretched impossibly wide across his face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Mark recoiled in terror. He tried to move away, but his body wouldn't respond. The whispers grew louder still, their voices overlapping and merging into a chorus of madness. The man stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, and Mark could see the other passengers starting to shift, their faces contorting into similar twisted smiles. "You're one of us now," the woman's voice echoed in his mind. "You're never leaving. None of us are." And then, with a sudden and terrifying clarity, Mark understood. This was not just a bus. This was a prison for the lost, the forgotten, and the damned. A prison where no one left, no one escaped. And Mark had become just another passenger, trapped for eternity in the endless ride. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the twisted, grinning face of the man who had been sitting in the back. The bus had stopped moving, but he was still trapped in the endless cycle of the ride, never to escape. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. "You're one of us now." Mark's surroundings seemed to warp, the world blurring into dark streaks. His mind felt as though it was being pulled apart by invisible threads, each thought stretched to its breaking point. The bus, the passengers, the streets outside, all of it faded, becoming something else, something alien. He could feel his consciousness slipping, like he was being drawn into a deep, endless void. The oppressive weight of the air around him grew thicker, suffocating him. He fought against it, tried to scream, but his voice was no more than a whisper in the vast, hollow silence that surrounded him. The man with the grotesque grin had moved closer, his hollow eyes fixed on Mark as though he were prey. The other passengers, those with their empty, expressionless faces, watched without emotion, as though they were waiting for something to happen. Mark's heart thudded painfully in his chest, each beat feeling like a drum that echoed in the suffocating dark. He reached out, grasping for anything that could break the spell. But nothing came. His fingers brushed the cold, smooth metal of the seat in front of him, but even that felt foreign, as if it had no connection to the world he had once known. And then he felt it, a sudden tug at the very core of his being. Something pulling at him, not physically but mentally, emotionally, like the very fabric of his reality was being unraveled. His thoughts began to fragment, the edges of his consciousness splintering into pieces. He could hear his own mind breaking, but the sound wasn't his own. It was the sound of the bus, of the passengers, of the very walls around him, all groaning and shifting as if alive. "You're one of us now," the voice whispered again, this time coming from everywhere. It was no longer just the woman, but the voices of all the passengers, overlapping and blending together into a single terrible chorus. Mark's breath quickened, his pulse racing as the truth settled in. The bus wasn't just a vehicle, it was a prison, a vessel that carried the lost and the damned through a never-ending night. Each of the passengers was a piece of this dark puzzle, trapped in this cursed cycle, never allowed to leave, never allowed to escape. He wasn't going to wake up from this. This wasn't some bad dream or nightmare he could escape from with the dawn. There was no dawn here, no escape. There was only the ride, endless, looping, and suffocating. "This is your home now, Mark," the woman said, her voice sharp and cold. "You'll never leave. Not in this life. Not in the next." His thoughts were becoming disjointed, scattered fragments of memories and fears clashing together. He remembered his old life, his friends, his family, the warmth of the sun on his skin. But it was all fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The bus was taking it all from him. His identity, his past, his future, they were all being consumed piece by piece. The man with the empty eyes stepped forward, his grin widening. The other passengers shifted in their seats, their bodies contorting in unnatural ways, their limbs twisting and jerking. They were all moving toward him now, their hollow eyes never blinking, their smiles never fading. Mark's mind screamed, but no sound came. The fear, the terror, it all grew, consuming him from the inside out. His body refused to respond, his legs like stone, his arms heavy as if made of lead. He was trapped, unable to run, unable to scream. And the voices grew louder, drowning out everything else. "You'll never escape," they whispered. "You're one of us now." With every passing second, Mark felt himself losing more of himself, slipping further into the abyss. His memories, his thoughts, his very sense of self, they were being eaten away by the bus, by the passengers, by the dark force that had taken hold of him. It wasn't just a ride, it was a transformation, a dark, twisted metamorphosis that took everything, leaving nothing behind but an empty husk. Mark felt his body tremble, his heart racing as he fought to hold on to something, anything. But there was nothing, no escape, no salvation. The bus was all there was now. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered once more. The world outside the bus dimmed, the road stretching out endlessly, devoid of life. Mark could feel it all slipping away. The world, his sense of reality, even the very idea of time. The passengers around him, their grotesque grins frozen on their faces, were no longer people. They were something else, something ancient, something that had always been here, lurking in the shadows. And Mark, he was just another part of the ride, another lost soul, destined to ride the endless loop of the bus until the end of time. The whispers echoed one final time, chilling and unrelenting. "You'll never leave." And with that, the last remnants of Mark's consciousness were swallowed by the darkness, his mind forever trapped in the endless, looping ride of the last bus home. The bus rolled on, its wheels grinding against the asphalt as if in sync with the rhythmic, hollow whispers that continued to reverberate in Mark's mind. The city outside was an indistinguishable blur of lights and shadows, like a distant memory fading into nothingness. He could no longer remember what had come before, what the world had been like outside this endless ride. His sense of time, of existence, had dissolved into the void. As he looked around the bus, the other passengers, those faceless, hollow-eyed figures, sat in eerie stillness, their eyes locked forward. Their features were an amalgamation of distorted shapes, flickering like a faulty television screen. Some of them didn't even appear human anymore. The woman who had spoken to him earlier, her voice like 1,000 scratching nails on glass, was now seated directly across from him, her once serene face contorted into a grotesque smile, as though she found some perverse joy in his torment. "How long have you been here?" he tried to ask, but his voice was thin, weak, like a whisper lost in the wind. There was no answer. The passengers didn't move, didn't acknowledge him in any way. But Mark knew they heard him. He knew they understood. The bus jolted suddenly, as though it had hit a bump in the road, though the streets outside remained eerily smooth, undisturbed. Mark's heart leaped in his chest, but he couldn't find the energy to move. His body felt like it had been weighed down by invisible chains, each movement a struggle. The woman across from him began to laugh, low, guttural, the kind of laughter that felt wrong. It wasn't a sound born from joy, but from something far more sinister. It seemed to come from deep within her, like a primal force that had long ago abandoned any trace of humanity. "Do you know what we are?" she asked, her voice cracking with each word, as if the very sound of it caused her pain. "Do you understand what it means to be a part of this ride?" Mark's mind reeled, his thoughts a mess of confusion and fear. He wanted to understand. He had to understand. But the more he tried, the more the words slipped away from him. It was as if some invisible force was erasing the very fabric of his thoughts, stealing the ability to make sense of anything. "You're not real," he muttered under his breath, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it anymore. The woman's grin widened, her teeth impossibly sharp, glinting in the dim light of the bus. "Real," she echoed, her voice taking on a mocking tone. "Real is a relative thing. What does it mean to be real? To be alive? To be anything at all?" Mark recoiled, his eyes darting around the bus, desperately seeking an escape, a way out. But there was no door, no windows. The walls had become a seamless, featureless expanse. The bus was all there was, all there ever would be. And then the lights flickered again. A flicker so quick, so sudden, that it felt as though reality itself had wavered. The passengers' faces blurred for a split second, their features distorting and reforming like a shattered mirror being pieced back together. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he watched them, each of them shifting in ways that defied logic, as though they were becoming something other than human. The woman's face twisted, her mouth opening impossibly wide, stretching beyond the limits of what should have been possible. Her eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, seemed to peer right through him, as if she could see into the very core of his being. "You think you're still alive, don't you?" she whispered, her voice now a chorus of distorted, overlapping tones, as though the others were speaking through her. "But you're not. None of us are. Not anymore." Mark's blood ran cold. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the horrors unfolding before him. Suddenly, the other passengers began to stir. Not all at once, but one by one, they moved in slow, deliberate motions. Their limbs twisted unnaturally, as if they were puppets with tangled strings. They began to hum in unison, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through Mark's bones, settling deep into the marrow. The air felt thicker now, heavy with an oppressive sense of foreboding. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as the humming grew louder, more insistent. His mind was struggling to process it, but the more he thought about it, the less sense it made. "Where are we going?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely audible. The woman across from him tilted her head, as if the question amused her. "Where do you think we're going?" she asked, her voice suddenly soft, almost pitying. Mark stared at her, his mind racing, but all he could see was the endless stretch of the dark road outside, the lights of the city now nothing more than distant flickers. The bus rolled on, its destination unknowable, its passengers unyielding in their silence. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the answer was given. "Nowhere. We're already here." The realization hit Mark like a physical blow. He wasn't just on a bus. He wasn't just trapped in a ride. He was part of the ride, part of something far darker and more insidious than he could have ever imagined. The hum intensified, the darkness closing in around him. The walls of the bus seemed to pulse, breathing with a life of their own. His body shook, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move. He was paralyzed, caught in the suffocating grip of something ancient, something that had no interest in letting him go. The bus continued its endless journey through the dark, the city outside now nothing more than a fleeting memory. And Mark was no longer sure if he was alive, or if he ever had been. All he knew was that the ride would never end. The bus hummed its relentless tune, and the world outside dissolved into nothingness. Mark's senses were dulled, his awareness slipping between consciousness and oblivion. His thoughts felt foggy, like a distant memory trying to break free from the haze. The faces of the passengers around him, those twisted, unnatural faces, blurred in and out of focus, their eyes still locked forward, never blinking, never acknowledging his presence. He wanted to scream, to escape, but it felt like his voice had been stolen. The oppressive silence around him was suffocating, broken only by the low, collective hum that vibrated through the bus. The seats, the walls, the very air itself seemed to pulse with a disturbing rhythm, as though the bus itself was alive. He tried to move, to stand, to run, but his body refused to obey. His legs were heavy, his arms like lead. Every time he tried to push himself forward, the bus jerked, and he was thrown back into his seat as though some unseen force was keeping him anchored. The woman across from him, her grotesque grin widening even further, tilted her head as if to study him more closely. "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" she said softly, her voice still an unsettling chorus of multiple tones. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. The bus has been here long before you. It will be here long after." Mark's mind raced, but her words had a cold finality to them. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. He had to escape. There had to be a way out. But every time he glanced out the window, the view outside had changed. At first, it was the same cityscape, a blur of lights and buildings. But now it was a desolate, empty stretch of road, lined with twisted, gnarled trees that seemed to reach toward the bus with claw-like branches. The sky above had turned an unnatural shade of dark purple, and there was no moon. No stars, just the oppressive blackness that swallowed everything in its path. The air inside the bus grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Mark's breath became visible in the dim light. He shivered, wrapping his arms around his body in a futile attempt to warm himself. Suddenly, the lights above flickered again, casting the bus in intermittent flashes of harsh light. For a brief moment, Mark saw the other passengers, those ghostly, monstrous figures, more clearly. Their faces were contorted in agony, their eyes hollow and unblinking, their features shifting like fluid. Some of them had no faces at all, just smooth, featureless skin. Others had mouths that were far too wide, their teeth too sharp, their skin stretched too thin. One of them, a man sitting near the back of the bus, turned his head toward Mark, his eyes empty but somehow knowing. He leaned forward, his mouth opening to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, Mark felt it, a pulse of raw, suffocating energy that flooded his mind, a wave of thoughts and images that weren't his own. He saw flashes of past passengers, people who had sat in this same bus, traveling the same endless road. Some of them were crying, some screaming, some simply staring into nothingness. All of them had the same dead, lifeless eyes. And then he saw the truth. The bus wasn't just a vehicle. It was a trap, a place between worlds, a purgatory for souls who had no place to go. The passengers weren't just passengers. They were lost souls, caught in an eternal loop, unable to escape. And now Mark was one of them. He wanted to scream, to tear at the walls of the bus, to beg for release, but the words never came. His body refused to move, and his mind felt like it was unraveling, the fear growing ever more suffocating. He could feel the presence of something watching him, something far older, far more powerful than he could comprehend. It wasn't the passengers, it was the bus itself. The hum grew louder, vibrating through Mark's very bones, until it became a deafening roar. His head throbbed with the intensity of it, and his vision blurred. He could no longer see the passengers. He could only hear the sound, the growing, overwhelming noise that seemed to shake the very fabric of reality. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the woman spoke again, her voice now clear and unambiguous. "It's time," she said, her smile wide and cruel. "Time to join the ride forever." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The weight of her words crushed him. There was no escape, no way out. The ride had no end. The bus continued its endless journey through the darkness, the cityscape outside now completely gone. There was only the infinite road ahead, stretching into oblivion. And as the bus rolled on, Mark realized that he was no longer sure if he had ever been alive at all. He was just another passenger, another lost soul caught in the eternal loop, trapped in the void of the last bus home. The hours, or was it days, slipped by, though Mark couldn't say how much time had truly passed. His sense of reality had shattered, leaving him suspended in an endless moment. He no longer knew if he was awake or dreaming, if the horrors he was witnessing were real or some twisted manifestation of his own mind. The other passengers remained unmoving, silent, their faces fixed in a state of eerie detachment. Some stared straight ahead, their eyes glazed over, while others seemed to breathe in unison with the bus itself, their chests rising and falling at the same unnatural rhythm. Mark tried to speak, to call out, but his voice was nothing more than a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence that filled the bus. No one responded. No one even acknowledged him. He glanced around, searching for something, anything that might offer a clue, a chance at escape. His eyes settled on the back of the bus, where a flickering light illuminated the farthest row of seats. There, in the dim glow, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a shadowy figure standing near the rear exit. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness, but Mark could make out the silhouette of a long, flowing coat, the edges frayed and worn. Its face, if it could be called that, was a blank, featureless mask, smooth and unsettling. No eyes, no mouth. Just a smooth, pale surface that seemed to reflect the dim light in a way that made it appear to shift with the movement of the bus. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to move, but his body betrayed him once again, frozen in place. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind screaming for him to act, to run, to do something, but his limbs refused to obey. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there watching him. The temperature in the bus dropped even further, a biting cold creeping into Mark's skin. He could see his breath clouding in front of him, the vapor swirling around as if it had a life of its own. The hum of the bus, which had been constant and suffocating, grew louder, as if it was resonating within his very skull. Then the figure's head slowly tilted to one side, its motion deliberate and unnervingly slow. The mask, that blank, expressionless face, seemed to shift slightly, as if the absence of features was somehow more horrifying than any visage could have been. Mark's pulse quickened. Could it be? Was the figure aware of him? Of his fear? His instincts screamed at him to look away, to ignore it, but he couldn't. He couldn't tear his gaze from the figure, even as it seemed to inch closer to him, its movement impossible to track, one moment stationary, the next standing right in front of him, its faceless mask looming over him like a nightmare made flesh. A low, guttural sound emanated from the figure, a sound that wasn't quite a voice, more like the sound of something scraping against metal, the hollow echo of a distant bell tolling. The air grew thick with the tension of it, and Mark felt something deep within him begin to stir, a primal fear, the kind of fear that didn't come from a rational place, but from something deep and ancient, buried in the core of his being. He could feel the presence of the figure pressing against him, pushing him deeper into his seat. The weight of it, the wrongness of it, threatened to suffocate him. His heart raced, the cold sweat clinging to his skin. And then, without warning, the figure lunged forward. Mark barely had time to react. His body screamed at him to move, but once again he was frozen, trapped in his seat, unable to escape the approaching nightmare. The world around him seemed to distort, the walls of the bus warping, the air thickening into something tangible, something that gripped at his very soul. His vision blurred as the figure reached out with long, clawed fingers, its touch icy cold against his skin. But as the fingers made contact, something happened. The figure's form seemed to flicker, like a broken television screen, its edges distorting and shifting. Mark could barely comprehend what he was seeing, but one thing became clear. The figure wasn't the only thing wrong with the bus. The whole place, the very fabric of reality itself, seemed to be unraveling. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then went out completely. For a moment, Mark was plunged into total darkness. The hum of the bus was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. He couldn't see a thing, couldn't hear a thing, and he was left in the suffocating void with only the sensation of something moving just beyond his reach. His breath caught in his throat. The air was thick with a presence, something large, something ancient, something hungry. It was as if the darkness itself had become a living thing, pressing in on him from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the lights flickered back on. But when Mark opened his eyes, the bus was no longer the same. The passengers, those twisted, monstrous figures, were gone. In their place were others. People, normal people, sitting in the seats, chatting softly among themselves, as though nothing had happened, as though there had never been anything wrong. Mark blinked, disoriented, unsure of what to believe. Had it all been a nightmare? Had he imagined it? He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, but more than that, he could feel it. The unmistakable weight of something deep inside him had changed. His connection to reality, to the world outside the bus, had snapped. He was no longer the same. And then, just as the thought struck him, he saw it, the door. The bus door, which had been locked shut for the entire journey, was now wide open. Beyond it was an inky blackness, a vast emptiness that stretched out into infinity. It was the road, but not the one they had been traveling on. It was the true last stop. Mark didn't hesitate. He didn't question it. He stood, his body moving of its own accord, and stepped into the darkness. And as he did, the door slammed shut behind him, and the bus sped away forever. The void outside the bus swallowed Mark whole, its emptiness stretching endlessly, as if the world itself had ceased to exist. The sensation was overwhelming, a sense of falling, of being caught in a space where time and place no longer had meaning. Mark's feet hit nothing solid. The ground beneath him seemed to ripple, as though he were walking on the surface of water that hadn't yet decided whether it was liquid or air. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic beat that felt out of place in the vast, silent expanse. He looked back toward the bus, but it had already vanished, leaving only the dark void stretching in all directions. There was no sound, no distant hum of a motor, no whisper of wind. Just a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed against his ears and made the air feel thick and suffocating. He was alone. Mark began to walk, though he had no clear destination. There was nowhere to go, no path to follow, but his feet carried him forward nonetheless, one step after another. He tried to make sense of what had happened, but the more he thought about it, the less it made any sense at all. The passengers on the bus, the strange, inhuman figures, had they been real? Or was it all just a product of his own unraveling mind? Suddenly, the darkness around him shifted. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the distance, something moving in the far reaches of the void. Mark stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. His senses were heightened now, aware of every shift in the atmosphere, every ripple in the air. The silence had been broken, and with it came an unsettling presence, one that he could feel but not see. Something was there. He wasn't alone. Mark's body tensed, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The void stretched on forever. Every direction felt like a dead end. Panic surged in his chest as the sensation of being watched grew stronger, closer. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, not far off in the distance, emerging from the darkness like a shadow taking form. It was tall, slender, and its movement was erratic, like it didn't belong to this place. Mark's heart raced as the figure seemed to glide toward him, floating rather than walking. Its features were indistinct, as if they shifted every time he tried to focus on them. The figure's presence was suffocating, filling the air with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. Mark couldn't move, couldn't speak. All he could do was stare at the shape that drew closer, its very existence a violation of everything that made sense. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It was close now, so close that Mark could feel its presence, like an invisible hand brushing against his skin. He could see the distortion it caused in the air, the way the dark around it seemed to warp, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. For a long moment, there was only the silence. Mark didn't dare to make a sound, afraid that even the smallest movement would provoke whatever it was in front of him. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, it spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." The words hissed through the air, not spoken aloud but felt within his mind, like a thought that didn't belong to him. The words were cold, hollow, and they reverberated through his very bones. Mark wanted to scream, but his voice betrayed him, trapped inside his throat. He felt the fear rising within him, his entire body trembling, his mind racing with thoughts of escape that had no form or meaning. The figure took a step closer. Its face, if it could be called that, was a blur of shifting shadows, features constantly changing, never settling into anything recognizable. But Mark could feel it, could sense the malice in the way it moved, the hunger in its presence. "You were never meant to board that bus," the figure continued, its voice sinking deeper into his thoughts. "It was a test, a choice, and you failed." Mark's chest tightened, panic rising like a tidal wave. He didn't understand. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it didn't matter. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. But the figure was still there, still watching, its form continuing to warp and shift in the dark, and Mark could feel its gaze burning into him. It wasn't just a presence, it was a thing of intent, a thing with purpose. "You will stay," the figure hissed. "You will stay forever." Mark felt the world around him shift again, the ground beneath him fading into an abyss that seemed to open up below him. He stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the empty void as if it had no substance, no foundation. There was no escape, no way out. The figure took another step toward him, and the void around Mark seemed to pulse, the very air alive with an unsettling energy that threatened to crush him. And then it was gone. Just like that, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the darkness and the eerie silence that followed. Mark stood in the middle of the void, gasping for breath, unsure of what had just happened. Was it real? Was any of it real? He didn't know. He couldn't know. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition, and he was left to wander in the endless, empty space with no way of knowing whether he was lost in his own mind or in a world beyond comprehension. And somewhere far away, a bus continued its journey, carrying passengers who were never meant to be seen by the living. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears, the silence pressing down on him with the weight of 1,000 questions he couldn't answer. His head throbbed with confusion, but he could still feel the chilling presence of the figure, the weight of its voice, and its promise that he would stay forever. He was in a place where nothing made sense. Time, space, reality, they were all distorted, twisted into something far beyond the world he knew. And yet, as he stood there, his eyes scanning the empty, endless black around him, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible flicker in the air, like the faintest trace of movement just beyond his reach. Mark instinctively turned his head, expecting to see something, anything. But when he looked, the darkness remained as still and suffocating as ever. It was then that he felt it, a whisper, a faint tremor in the air, almost as if the void itself was vibrating with anticipation. A low, unsettling hum began to grow, rising from the ground beneath him. At first, it was just a vibration, a hum that he could feel in his chest. But it grew louder, and before long, the sound was overwhelming, reverberating through the very fabric of the empty space. And then in the distance he saw it, a flicker of light. At first, it was just a speck like the distant glow of a far-off star. But as Mark focused on it, it grew brighter, sharper, like the headlight of an approaching vehicle in the dark. The hum intensified, almost as if the light itself was pulling it toward it, drawing everything around it into its gravitational pull. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. The light grew larger, closer. The hum turned into a low growl, a sound so deep and guttural that Mark could feel it in his bones. He tried to shield his eyes, but the brightness overwhelmed him, searing through his thoughts like a hot knife cutting through butter. He squinted against the blinding glow, feeling its heat begin to press against his skin. His heart raced, and his breath quickened. The light finally took shape. It was the bus, the same bus, the one he had boarded just hours ago. But it was different now. It wasn't a simple mode of transportation anymore. It was something alive, something that had changed, that had become twisted in a way Mark couldn't comprehend. The once familiar shape of the bus was now contorted, its metal frame warping in unnatural ways, and its windows were black, as if they were portals into nothingness. Mark's breath caught in his throat. There was no mistaking it. The bus was here, and it was no longer the vehicle he had ridden earlier. It had transformed into something else, something monstrous. The doors of the bus swung open with a deafening creak, and Mark could hear the sound of movement inside, the scraping of feet across the floor, the shuffle of bodies. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to flee from the nightmare, but his body remained rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force had locked him in place. From the darkness inside the bus, a figure emerged. It was the driver, but he was no longer the man Mark had seen when he first boarded. The driver's features were distorted, his skin pale and stretched tight across his bones, his eyes hollow and empty. He moved with unnatural jerks, his head tilting at odd angles as he stepped down onto the platform, his hands reaching for the railing as if he were unsure of how to move properly. The man's mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and he let out a low, gurgling laugh that echoed through the emptiness. Mark felt his heart stop in his chest. This was no longer a bus, and these were no longer the passengers he had shared the ride with. They had become something else, something far darker. The passengers were standing now, their bodies twisted and contorted, their limbs elongated and misshapen. They moved like puppets, jerking and swaying with the same unnatural rhythm that the driver had. They weren't human. None of them were. Mark stumbled back, his legs finally finding the strength to move, but the figure at the front of the bus, the one who had spoken to him earlier, was standing there now, blocking his way. Its face was a blur of shifting darkness, an impossible shape that defied all logic. It reached out with long, thin fingers, its skin dark and cracked like the surface of dried clay. "You're still here," it said, the voice now more solid, more real. It wasn't just in his mind anymore. "You haven't left." Mark's stomach twisted, his body frozen in place once more. He wanted to scream, to run, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was paralyzed with fear, trapped in a loop of terror he couldn't escape. The figure stepped closer, its dark form looming over him like a shadow that consumed everything in its path. "You were never meant to leave," the figure whispered, its voice now a hiss that reverberated through the air. "You never will." The words echoed in Mark's mind, growing louder, more insistent, until they were the only sound in the universe. And then, like the final snap of a thread, Mark felt his grip on reality shatter. The light of the bus consumed him. The hum of the engine, the distorted figures, the endless stretch of darkness, all of it blurred into a single point of unrelenting brightness. And as the light took over, Mark knew, deep in his soul, that there was no escape. The last bus had come to take him home, but it wasn't home at all. It was his prison. The light enveloped Mark, searing through his mind, through every fiber of his being. He couldn't see, couldn't think. There was nothing but a blinding whiteness that consumed him entirely. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His body was weightless, floating in a void, suspended between something that felt like life and something that felt like death. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the light faded and Mark's senses returned, but everything was wrong. He found himself no longer standing on the ground, but sitting in a seat. The familiar hum of the bus engine buzzed in his ears, but it wasn't the same bus he'd gotten on earlier. No, this bus was far larger, its interior vast and unrecognizable. The walls seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction, their surfaces pulsating with an unsettling, organic rhythm, as if the very walls themselves were alive. The seats around him were filled with the same twisted, contorted figures, passengers whose eyes were locked in eerie stares, faces frozen in grotesque expressions that seemed to reach out, demanding his attention. Mark tried to move, but his body refused to respond. His limbs were heavy, like they were made of lead. His mouth opened, but the words didn't come. The figures around him remained silent, their gaze unblinking, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him, perhaps. And then the driver's voice echoed through the intercom, breaking the silence with its distorted, otherworldly tone. "Your journey has only just begun, Mark," the driver intoned, his voice low and menacing. "You have nowhere else to go." The words hit Mark like a slap to the face. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. Where was he? What was this place? Why was he trapped here with these things? The bus rumbled beneath him, and Mark felt the cold grip of panic tighten around his throat. He tried to stand, to fight against the force that held him down, but his body betrayed him. It was as if some invisible force was restraining him, forcing him to stay seated, to stay where he was meant to be. As the bus rumbled forward, Mark's gaze fell to the passengers seated around him. They were no longer motionless. They were moving now, shifting and twitching, as if they were just waking from a long, unnatural slumber. One by one, their eyes turned toward him, their faces contorting in grotesque smiles, lips curling back to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The air grew thick with a suffocating sense of dread. One of the passengers, a woman with long, dark hair that hung like a veil over her face, leaned toward him. Her breath was hot against his ear as she whispered, "You'll never leave, Mark. You're one of us now." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The words were like poison, sinking deep into his soul, infecting him with a terror so primal, so raw, that he felt his body tremble in response. His eyes darted around the bus, searching for any sign of escape, but the darkness outside the windows only deepened, the streets blurring into an endless void. The bus didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It just kept moving forward, its path endless, its destination unclear. Mark's thoughts began to spin out of control. He tried to recall how he had gotten here, tried to remember the simple, mundane day that had led him to this nightmare. But the more he thought, the more elusive the memories became. It was as if the bus was pulling him away from everything he had ever known, from the life he had once lived, until all that was left was the oppressive silence and the growing sense that he would never escape. "Why are you doing this?" Mark finally managed to croak, his voice cracking with fear. The figure at the front of the bus, the one who had spoken to him before, turned its head slowly, its twisted form jerking unnaturally as it fixed its empty gaze on him. There was no pity, no remorse in its eyes, just a cold, indifferent emptiness that chilled Mark to the core. "We're doing this because you belong to us now," the figure answered, its voice low and hollow. "You were chosen, Mark. The last bus is always the one that takes you home, whether you want to go or not." Mark's stomach lurched. Home. The word reverberated in his mind, and he realized with a sinking horror that he had no idea where home even was anymore. Was he still on Earth? Was he dead? Was this some kind of hell? His thoughts twisted into chaos, spiraling into a dark abyss from which he could not return. And then, with a sudden, sharp jolt, the bus came to a screeching halt. The screeching of the brakes was deafening, rattling through Mark's bones, and the harsh stop threw him forward in his seat. He barely caught himself, his hands gripping the cold metal armrests to steady himself. Outside, the darkness pressed in even tighter, wrapping itself around the bus like a suffocating blanket. The doors of the bus opened, but no one moved. The passengers, still staring at him with those lifeless eyes, made no attempt to leave. Mark was paralyzed with fear, his body refusing to obey his desperate command to flee. The air felt thick, stagnant, as if time had stopped entirely. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a movement in the distance, a faint flicker of light. It was so far away, but it was enough to send a shockwave through him. Was it real? Was it his escape? Without thinking, Mark shot to his feet, ignoring the searing pain that shot through his limbs. He ran toward the doors of the bus, pushing past the motionless passengers. His heart pounded wildly in his chest as he leaped toward the exit. But as his fingers touched the door, it slammed shut with a force that rattled his bones. The hum of the engine roared back to life, and the eerie voice of the driver echoed once again. "You can't leave, Mark. This is your destination." Mark's scream tore through the air, but it was swallowed by the sound of the bus's engine as it roared forward once more, disappearing into the endless night. And Mark was trapped. The world outside the bus remained shrouded in darkness, a vast and unyielding expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled backward, his mind racing with terror. The bus wasn't just moving through space, it was moving through something else, something far beyond anything he could comprehend. The walls of the bus felt closer now, oppressive, as if they were closing in on him. The other passengers remained unmoving, their eyes still fixed on him, unblinking, unfeeling. The woman with the dark hair, the one who had whispered to him earlier, leaned closer, her smile widening. Her teeth were unnaturally sharp, her gaze predatory. "You should have stayed asleep," she murmured, her voice a low hiss that sent shivers crawling down Mark's spine. "You're part of the journey now. You've crossed the line, Mark. There's no going back." Mark backed away from her, panic flooding his senses. He needed to escape. He had to get off this bus, no matter what it took. But every attempt to move felt like wading through molasses, his body growing heavier with each passing second. It was as if the bus itself was pulling him deeper into its grip, dragging him toward some unknown end. He turned toward the windows, desperate to find something familiar, something that might offer an escape, but all he saw was the endless void. The city he knew, the streets, the buildings, the people, had all disappeared. There was nothing left but darkness. The lights from the street lamps outside flickered erratically, casting strange, distorted shadows across the bus. Mark's heart raced faster as he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of isolation, as if he were suspended in a liminal space between worlds. And then, the lights inside the bus flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. The entire world plunged into an inky blackness. Mark couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. He heard the rustling of bodies in the dark, the shuffling of feet, the sound of breathing, not his own, but the breath of the others, the passengers who surrounded him. It was cold now, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his bones. A voice, thin, strained, like a whisper from the farthest corners of his mind, cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have gotten on the bus, Mark. You should have stayed where you belonged." Mark's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice. It was the driver, the same distorted, hollow voice from before. But this time it was closer, much closer. The sound seemed to come from all around him, wrapping around him, pressing in on him. "No one leaves the last bus, Mark," the voice continued, its tone dripping with malice. "Not unless they pay the price." The air seemed to thicken, and Mark's chest tightened with dread. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth felt dry, his throat tight. The darkness pressed in, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly there was movement. A figure appeared in the darkness, its outline barely visible against the void. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and as it drew closer, Mark felt a surge of terror unlike anything he'd ever known. The figure's movements were jerky, its limbs too long, its body too thin. It stopped right in front of Mark, and a pair of glowing eyes pierced through the dark, locking onto his own. Mark couldn't look away. His body refused to obey him, his eyes fixed on the figure as it leaned closer, its breath cold against his skin. "You're not alone, Mark," the voice said, but it wasn't the driver's anymore. It was a different voice, low, guttural, as if it were coming from deep within the earth itself. "We've been waiting for you." Mark tried to scream, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the oppressive dark. The figure raised its hand, and with a flick of its long, bony fingers, the lights of the bus flickered back to life. But the world that greeted him wasn't the same as before. The bus was no longer filled with the quiet, unnerving figures of the passengers. Instead, the seats were empty, and the aisle stretched on endlessly. The walls of the bus had become translucent, revealing the twisted landscape outside, a twisted, decaying version of the city he once knew, where the buildings sagged and groaned under the weight of their own decay, and the streets were covered in a thick, oily fog. Mark's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He looked out of the window and saw a shape, something large and dark moving toward the bus, its form shifting and changing, as if it were made of shadows and smoke. It was the creature from the dark. The bus began to lurch forward again, slowly at first, then picking up speed, faster and faster, as if the driver had no intention of stopping. Mark could feel the cold wind rush past him, even though the windows were closed, and the eerie sensation that they were being pulled into something terrible, grew stronger with each passing second. The figure in the dark was growing closer. Mark could hear its footsteps now, the sound of something large and heavy dragging itself toward the bus. It wasn't human. Nothing about it was human. In the dim light of the bus, Mark could see the creature's eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, staring at him through the window. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glinted in the darkness, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within its chest. The bus was speeding toward it, and Mark's mind raced for any possible way out, but the doors remained sealed. The windows were locked. There was nowhere to go. He was trapped. The creature reached the bus, its long fingers tapping against the glass. Mark recoiled, his heart racing as he backed away from the window. But the thing didn't stop there. It began to slam its body against the bus, shaking the entire vehicle with each hit. The metal groaned, the glass cracked, but it didn't break. And then, with a terrible screech, the bus came to a sudden halt, sending Mark tumbling forward. The creature was there, standing at the front of the bus, its eyes glowing in the dark, its teeth bared in a sinister grin. Mark's body froze in terror, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The creature was no longer an illusion. It was real, and it had come for him. The last bus had arrived, and Mark was its final destination. The creature's eyes bore into Mark, its glowing orbs flickering like distant stars in a sky that held no light. The bus seemed to groan under its weight, the walls trembling as the thing outside pressed itself against the fragile glass. Mark could feel his pulse in his throat, a loud, deafening thrum that filled his ears. The driver's voice echoed in the darkness, its hollow tone reverberating through the metal of the bus. "You've crossed the threshold, Mark. Now you must pay the price." Mark stumbled backward, his hands clawing at the seat for support. His mind raced, scrambling for a way out, but there was nothing. The bus, the night, the city, it all felt like it was closing in on him, a trap from which there would be no escape. The creature outside shifted, its long limbs extending, pressing against the bus like a hunter closing in on its prey. It reached up, its jagged nails scraping across the glass, and Mark recoiled in terror, instinctively ducking as though it could reach through the thin material. It wasn't just looking at him, it was waiting, savoring the moment. "Please," Mark muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The creature's lips twisted into a grotesque smile, its teeth glinting in the dim light. It didn't answer directly. Instead, it raised a hand, clawed fingers brushing against the glass as if caressing the surface. Then, with a speed that left Mark's breath stolen, it lunged forward, crashing against the window with a force that shook the entire bus. The glass spiderwebbed, cracks spreading out from where the creature's body collided. But it didn't break. "It won't let you go," the voice of the driver called out again, and this time, Mark could hear the edges of something almost like amusement in it. "You're already part of the journey." The air in the bus grew heavy, suffocating, thick with the presence of the creature outside. Mark couldn't even tell if he was hearing the sound of his own heartbeat or the pulsing of the bus's engine, which had grown louder, more insistent, as though urging him to understand that there was no turning back. The other passengers, those silent, lifeless figures, hadn't moved. Their eyes remained locked forward, all of them unblinking. Mark's gaze darted between them, the creeping realization setting in. None of them were real. None of them had ever been real. They were just shadows of what had been, just echoes in a world that no longer made sense. As Mark's thoughts spiraled, the bus jolted forward again, the creature outside growing closer. The dim lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows across the bus, the flickering now erratic, as if the power was being drained away by an unseen force. Mark didn't know how much time had passed. It felt like seconds, but it also felt like years. The night stretched out like an eternity. The bus sped up. Faster. Faster. Mark's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, his chest tight. He grabbed the nearest seat, holding onto it as if for dear life, staring out of the cracked window. The creature's face was now mere inches from the glass, its features contorted into something inhuman, its breath fogging up the window. "You don't belong here, Mark," the voice of the driver repeated, now growing more distorted, like a warped radio signal. "You've taken the wrong bus." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears, his vision blurring with fear. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The driver wasn't human either. Neither was the bus. None of this was real. The bus was speeding into a place that wasn't a part of the world he knew, a place between worlds, where the living and the dead collided, and where things that shouldn't exist thrived in the dark. He glanced up at the driver, but there was no face, just a dark void in the shape of a head. The figure slumped behind the wheel, motionless. Mark felt his throat tighten, a lump rising in his chest. The bus wasn't in his control. It had never been. He had become part of its twisted route. Outside the window, the creature began to slink away, retreating into the shadows. Mark's relief was short-lived, however, as the dim streetlights flickered one last time, plunging the bus back into near-total darkness. His heart hammered painfully in his chest as he tried to adjust to the sudden absence of light. Then the bus lurched to a stop. There was no sound outside, no movement, no indication of where they had arrived. Mark stood, his legs unsteady beneath him as he moved toward the front of the bus, approaching the empty driver's seat. The air was thick with a suffocating silence, and the bus felt even more oppressive now, like a tomb. As he reached the door, it opened on its own, the sound of the hinges creaking as it swung outward into an unknown void. Mark hesitated, his breath ragged. What lay beyond the door? Was it the same city he had known, or something else entirely? Something worse? The night stretched out before him, darker and more hostile than he had ever known. The passengers on the bus were still, unmoving, as if frozen in time, waiting for something. Mark stepped out of the bus. The door slammed shut behind him, echoing in the oppressive stillness. And then, the darkness consumed him completely. It was quiet, but something shifted in the dark. A whisper, a voice that seemed to emanate from everywhere, from the very air itself. "You've missed your stop, Mark." And he understood in that moment that the last bus home was never about getting back. It was about staying there forever. The air around Mark felt heavy, thick with an unnatural presence, and yet there was nothing tangible to see. The darkness seemed to press in from every angle, the very ground beneath his feet soft, as though the earth itself were not entirely solid. He felt no sense of direction, no hint of familiar landmarks, nothing to confirm he was still in the world he had known. The sound of the bus's engine faded into the distance, leaving him in an eerie silence broken only by the whispering wind, which carried a hint of something ancient and malevolent. He turned around, expecting to see the bus still there, but the moment he looked back, it was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever been there at all. "You're here now," the voice spoke again, its tone chilling and distant, yet unnervingly close. It was a voice that felt like it belonged to no single entity, but rather something collective, as though the very air around him was speaking. Mark's heart raced, the pounding in his chest overwhelming. He looked around wildly, his breath coming in shallow gasps, as the realization slowly sunk in. He was trapped in a place that didn't belong to the world he knew. This place was not even a part of reality. It was something else entirely, something otherworldly. And whatever that voice was, it was not offering him any hope of escape. He stumbled forward, his legs unsteady, driven by some primal urge to move, to get away from the unknown voice and the crushing weight of the darkness. The ground beneath him shifted, as though it were alive, undulating with an unsettling, fluid motion. Each step he took felt like he was sinking deeper into a nightmare. "Where are you going, Mark?" The voice echoed again, its words like claws scraping against his skin. There was no malice in it, no anger, only an unsettling calmness, as though this was exactly what was supposed to happen. Mark's stomach churned. The panic rising in his chest clawed at him, but he had no idea where to run, where to hide. He felt as though he was walking in a vast, empty void, an endless stretch of darkness and silence that swallowed him whole. The coldness in the air cut through him, like the chill of the grave itself. Every step he took seemed to lead him further into a place that was completely alien, where time no longer existed, and the world had become a distant memory. He had to escape. He had to find a way out. "There's no way back," the voice whispered. It was a simple, matter-of-fact statement, yet the weight of it pressed down on Mark, pushing him further into despair. He stopped. There was no point in running. There was nowhere to go. The darkness had become his prison, and whatever force had drawn him here would not let him leave. "You'll never leave this place, Mark," the voice murmured again, softer this time, as if trying to comfort him. But there was nothing comforting about it. Not anymore. Mark's breath hitched, the realization settling like a stone in his chest. He wasn't meant to get out. He had crossed some boundary, taken a step that had sealed his fate. The last bus home wasn't about getting to a destination. It was about being trapped in an endless loop, forever stuck in this place where time and space twisted and warped, where the rules of reality no longer applied. "You're one of us now," the voice continued. "One of the lost. One of the forgotten." The ground beneath Mark's feet began to shift again, this time with more urgency. The air around him seemed to ripple as the darkness deepened, a swirling vortex of shadows that surrounded him from all sides. He could feel something pulling at him, something unseen, but powerful, relentless. It felt like it was consuming him, erasing him from existence. But even as he felt himself being drawn into the abyss, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that the darkness wasn't just swallowing him, it was waiting for him. The wind picked up, howling around him as if to mock his futile attempts to fight back. His limbs felt heavy, his body weighed down by the oppressive force surrounding him. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness, to the inescapable truth that there was no way out. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the whispering stopped. The world around him fell still, silent, as if everything had paused. For a moment, he thought he had escaped, but when he opened his eyes, the darkness was still there. It hadn't gone away, it had simply changed. And that's when he saw it. The figure stood before him, tall and twisted, with elongated limbs and eyes that burned like embers in the void. Its features were obscured by the shadows, but Mark could feel its presence, its hunger. It was the same figure that had been riding the bus, the one he'd seen in glimpses through the fog of his fear, the one who had been watching him from the moment he stepped onto that bus. "You are mine now," it whispered, its voice resonating through the air. Mark couldn't look away. It was like a magnet, pulling him toward it, drawing him into its gaze. The ground began to tremble beneath him, the air thick with a sense of finality. Mark knew with absolute certainty that his fate had been sealed long before he had boarded the last bus home. There would be no escape, no redemption. And as the figure loomed closer, Mark realized with a cold shiver that he wasn't just lost in this place, he had become part of it. The darkness closed in, and everything went silent. The silence stretched on, stretching like an eternal void where no sound could escape. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, each beat like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. He could feel the weight of the figure's presence pressing on him, the cold touch of its gaze, even though he couldn't look away from it. His legs had grown heavy, frozen in place, but he didn't dare move. His body trembled, and his mind raced, struggling to grasp the magnitude of the moment. "You're not like them," the figure whispered, its voice soft yet filled with dark understanding. It circled him, its movements fluid, unnatural. "You came here of your own volition. You had a choice." Mark's breath hitched in his throat, panic tightening like a vice around his chest. A choice? He hadn't had a choice. He had boarded the bus, tired from a long day, desperate to get home. He had no idea what he was stepping into, no knowledge that this was what awaited him. But even as the words formed in his mind, he felt an odd sense of resignation. This wasn't just a mistake or coincidence. There was something bigger at play here, something he had failed to see. The figure, now just inches away, stopped its movement, looming in front of him like an ominous, towering shadow. It didn't have a face, just an unsettling distortion in the air, the outlines of its shape flickering as though it were made of smoke and shifting darkness. "You've been chosen," the figure continued, and Mark could feel the words in his bones, vibrating through him, settling deep into his soul. "Not everyone gets the privilege of knowing the truth. But you're different. You see things others can't. You felt it from the moment you stepped on the bus, didn't you?" Mark's mind raced. The pieces were slowly starting to come together, though they didn't make sense. The strange passengers on the bus, the way they'd looked at him, the way the whole night had felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. It was all too much to process, too much to understand, yet here it was, unfolding in front of him. "The others," Mark muttered, his voice breaking. "The passengers on the bus. They're not human, are they?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it cocked its head, as if pondering the question. Then it leaned in closer, its cold, empty presence consuming all the warmth in the air. "Human? Perhaps once," it whispered. "But not anymore. The city takes what it needs. The night is hungry, and it feeds on the lost, the forgotten, those who wander too far from the path. You see, you're not the first to make this journey, and you won't be the last." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. The weight of the words pressed on him. He thought of the bus again, of the passengers who had been so strange, how they hadn't spoken much, how their eyes glinted with something that felt wrong. But it wasn't just the passengers. It was the very bus itself, the way it had seemed to appear out of nowhere, the way the route had felt impossible to navigate. He didn't know how much time had passed, how long they had been standing here. He could barely grasp the passage of time in this place. It could have been moments, or it could have been days. Everything was distorted, unmoored from reality. But one thing was painfully clear. He was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare with no way out. "What happens now?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. It seemed pointless to ask, but he couldn't help himself. He needed to know, needed some small piece of understanding, no matter how hopeless it was. The figure tilted its head again, almost amused, before taking a step back, its form flickering. It was as though the creature was contemplating the question. It didn't need to answer in words. Mark could feel the answer in his bones. It wasn't a matter of what happened next. It was a matter of what had already happened. "You are already part of this place," the figure said, its voice now no more than a breath. "This is your home now. The city, it takes everyone who truly belongs. You won't remember the world you came from. Not really. You'll forget what it means to be human. And in time you'll join us. You'll walk the streets with the others. And you'll feed the hunger of the night." Mark shook his head, panic flooding his mind, his thoughts a jumbled mess of disbelief and horror. No, this couldn't be real. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. His mind clung to the fading memories of his life, his apartment, his job, his family. But those things were slipping through his fingers, like sand in an hourglass. But then, the realization came crashing down on him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his family. He couldn't even remember how long it had been since he'd gotten on the bus. The more he tried to remember, the more the details became blurred and distorted, until they simply vanished. "You're already one of us," the figure repeated, the words echoing in Mark's mind. "And now, you'll help us find the next." The air around Mark turned colder still, the ground beneath his feet growing soft, like he was sinking into something far darker, far deeper. The streets of the city stretched out in all directions, endless and desolate, a place where no one belonged and yet everyone was claimed. Mark's vision blurred, his limbs heavy as if the very darkness itself were dragging him down into its depths. He wanted to scream, to fight, but he had no strength left. It was as if his soul itself had been drained, leaving him nothing more than an empty vessel. And then, just as the last shred of his resistance shattered, Mark felt the cold hands of the darkness envelop him. He was no longer a man, he was part of something far worse. The city had claimed him, and now, like the others before him, he would walk the streets, a lost soul trapped forever in the dark. The bus ride had ended, but Mark's journey had just begun, and it would never, ever end. The city stretched endlessly before him, its towering structures looming like silent, indifferent giants. The streets were always bathed in shadow, no matter the time of day. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, punctuated only by the distant echoes of footsteps that never seemed to come from any specific direction. Mark walked, though it didn't feel like walking. His legs moved of their own accord, as though he were being pulled along by something far beyond his control. His feet tapped lightly on the cold pavement, though he was sure there was no ground beneath him, just an endless black void, stretching out into oblivion. He had forgotten what it was like to be human, to be someone who had purpose, who had a life outside of this endless nightmare. His memories were fragmented, like shattered glass that he couldn't piece back together. Faces came and went in flashes, his family, his friends, but their names had faded. They were just whispers, lost voices in the wind. As he walked, he saw others, figures that were both familiar and strange. People who looked like they had once been like him, yet they were hollow now, shells of who they had been. Their eyes, dark and vacant, followed him with an eerie intensity, yet they didn't speak. They moved like shadows, drifting through the streets, as if they were bound to the same eternal rhythm. Mark's feet took him down a narrow alley, the walls on either side jagged and cracked, as though the city itself was decaying. The air here was colder, thicker, like it was suffused with some invisible force that weighed heavily on his chest. He didn't question it, though. There was no reason to. Nothing mattered anymore. And then, in the distance, he saw something that made his pulse quicken. A flicker of movement in the shadows, a fleeting glimpse of someone, or something, moving quickly through the darkness. Mark's heart lurched, a flash of recognition sparking in the depths of his memory. It was the figure from the bus, the one who had spoken to him, the one who had shown him the truth of this cursed place. He took a step toward it, his body moving faster, almost against his will. He needed to know. He had to know what it all meant. Why was he here? Why was he trapped in this nightmarish version of the city? The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by the cloak of shadows that seemed to cling to it. But Mark could feel its presence, the pull of its gaze, drawing him closer. He didn't think about it. He just moved. "You're not like the others," the figure spoke, its voice barely more than a rasp, a sound that scraped against his mind. "You still have questions, don't you?" Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry, but he nodded. "Why am I here?" he asked, his voice hoarse and weak. "What is this place?" The figure stepped forward, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You were chosen," it said, its voice dripping with an unsettling mix of pity and amusement. "You came to the city because you were lost. You wanted something, didn't you? Something that you couldn't find in your own world." Mark's head spun as the words sank in. He had been lost. That was the truth. The emptiness that had gnawed at him, the feeling of being disconnected from the life he had once known. It all made sense now. But there was something more. Something darker. The figure tilted its head, as if considering him. "You were never meant to find your way back," it whispered. "This city, it takes in those who are empty. It fills the void. And now you belong here. Just like the rest of us. Mark's stomach turned. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body wouldn't move. He was trapped, bound by forces he couldn't comprehend. The figure reached out and placed a cold, skeletal hand on his shoulder. "You will remember soon enough," it said. "The city has a way of making you forget. You'll forget what you were before. You'll forget everything. And in time, you'll become one of us." A chill swept through Mark's body, the words sinking into his very soul. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept it. But deep down, he knew it was true. There was no way out. He had become part of this place, a forgotten soul doomed to wander its endless streets. "Who were you before?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. What happened to you?" The figure's eyes glowed faintly, as though they were reflecting a deep, internal darkness. "I was like you," it said softly. "I was once human. I had a life, a purpose. But the city, it takes what it needs. And when it's finished with you, it leaves you here. In the dark. Forever." The figure's hand left his shoulder, and it began to fade into the shadows. Mark wanted to call out, to ask more questions, but no words came. He was alone now, just another soul lost in the city, another forgotten face in a world that no longer cared. He took a shaky step forward, the ground beneath him seeming to shift with each movement. His thoughts were jumbled, his mind clouded with confusion and dread. But one thing was certain, there was no escape. The city had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. And in time, he would forget everything that came before. His steps echoed in the silence, the sound fading into the darkness as he walked deeper into the city, swallowed by its cold, unyielding embrace. There were no answers here, only the endless night. The last bus home had brought him to this place. And now, he was just another passenger, lost in the shadows, with nowhere to go but deeper into the dark. Mark walked for what felt like hours, though time had lost all meaning in this forsaken place. The streets twisted and turned, looping back on themselves in ways that defied logic. Every building seemed the same, an endless repetition of faceless walls and darkened windows. There was no light here, no stars, no moon, just an oppressive, all-encompassing blackness that felt like it was closing in on him. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, punctuated only by the occasional sound of his footsteps echoing on the pavement. He tried to focus on them, the rhythm of his movement, but even that seemed hollow now. His thoughts were fragmented, slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt anything other than this emptiness. He paused at an intersection, his eyes scanning the surrounding buildings for any sign of life. The street lamps, though old and cracked, flickered faintly, casting long, jagged shadows on the ground. He noticed, with a jolt, that the shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and contorting unnaturally. They whispered to him, though he couldn't make out the words. Their presence sent a shiver down his spine. He had to keep moving. He had to find answers. But no matter which way he turned, the streets remained eerily the same. The buildings loomed like silent sentinels, blocking his path in every direction. It was as if the city had swallowed him whole, trapping him in its labyrinth of endless alleyways and forgotten roads. And he realized, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that the city was alive. It was a living, breathing entity, one that thrived on the souls it consumed, and now it was feeding on him. A cold breeze brushed past him, and Mark instinctively turned, his heart racing. There, standing at the end of the alley, was a figure. It was tall, its silhouette barely distinguishable against the blackness. The figure was unmoving, staring at him with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The same hollow, empty eyes he had seen on the others, the ones who walked the streets like lost souls. But this one was different. This one was waiting. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he took a hesitant step forward. His body screamed at him to run, to escape, but something held him there, rooted to the spot. He needed to know. He needed answers, even if they came at the cost of his sanity. The figure didn't move as he approached, its eyes following him with an almost predatory intensity. When Mark was only a few feet away, the figure spoke, its voice a low, gravelly rasp that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "You shouldn't be here." Mark's throat tightened, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this place? What happened to me? Why can't I leave?" The figure's mouth twisted into a smile, a grin that seemed too wide, too unnatural. "You can't leave because you never truly arrived," it said, its voice dripping with something darker, something ancient. "You were never meant to come here. You were lost. You wandered too far, and now you belong to the city." Mark stumbled backward, his mind reeling. "No," he gasped. "This can't be real. I was on the bus. I was going home. This isn't real." The figure's smile only grew wider, its eyes burning with an intensity that made Mark feel as though they were drilling into his very soul. "Oh, but it's real," it said softly. "This is where the lost go. This is where the forgotten find their end." Mark's chest tightened, and a sharp pain shot through his skull as the weight of the words hit him. The bus, the city, it was all part of the same nightmare, a never-ending cycle of hopelessness and despair. He had been chosen, just as the others had been chosen. And now there was no escape. "You can't fight it," the figure continued, its voice now like a cold wind. "You can't outrun it. You are already a part of it." Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as the darkness seemed to close in on him. The figure stepped closer, its long, bony fingers reaching out, brushing against his arm. The touch was icy like death itself, and Mark recoiled, but his legs wouldn't obey. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. "Welcome home," the figure whispered, its smile widening further, until its face was nothing but a gaping maw of darkness. "You're just another ghost now, another forgotten soul, wandering the streets of the city forever." The world around Mark began to distort, the buildings warping and twisting like they were made of paper. The shadows lengthened, merging together into a mass of writhing tendrils that seemed to reach for him. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt the cold, suffocating grip of the city wrap around him, pulling him deeper into its heart. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The figure was gone. The streets were still. Mark stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. But the silence was deafening. The city had taken him. There was no doubt in his mind now. He was a part of it, lost in the darkness, just like all the others. And as he turned to face the endless maze of streets before him, he realized the truth. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The city was full of them, souls who had wandered too far, who had gotten lost in the shadows. They were everywhere waiting, watching, just like him. And now they would all wait together, trapped in the dark for eternity. The city stretched before him like a vast, endless expanse, its streets looping and spiraling in on themselves. Mark could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him in the oppressive silence. He looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling as the realization settled in like a cold stone in his stomach. He was one of them now. He was one of the lost. But even as he stood there, rooted to the spot, something stirred in the depths of his mind. A small, quiet voice, barely a whisper in the back of his thoughts, urged him to move, to do something, to fight back. For the first time since he had entered this nightmare city, Mark felt the faintest spark of defiance flicker inside him. Maybe he wasn't destined to be another forgotten soul. Maybe there was still a way out. He began walking, his steps slow at first, as if the city itself was reluctant to let him go. But the voice in his mind pushed him forward, urging him to keep moving. He didn't know what he was searching for, but he knew he had to find it. There had to be an answer, some way to escape the endless cycle. As Mark walked, he noticed the shadows seemed to follow him, twisting and writhing at the corners of his vision. They were watching him, waiting. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears with their maddening chorus. They wanted him to give up, to succumb to the darkness. But Mark refused. He pressed on, his heart racing with determination. He had to find the source of this nightmare. He had to uncover the truth about the city, about the figures that lurked within it, about what had happened to him. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity of walking, he came to a large, crumbling building at the center of the city. Its windows were dark and empty, its doors ajar as if inviting him inside. The air around it felt charged with something old, something ancient. Mark hesitated. He could feel the presence of the city closing in around him, its cold fingers tightening around his chest. But the voice inside him urged him forward. This was it. This was where he would find the answers. He stepped inside the building, the door creaking shut behind him. The interior was shrouded in darkness, but he could just make out the faintest glow emanating from the far end of the room. Without thinking, he moved toward it, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he drew closer, he saw the source of the light, a small, flickering candle sitting atop a stone pedestal. The flame danced in the still air, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And as Mark approached, he realized there was something, or someone, standing before it. A figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by a hood. It was standing perfectly still, unmoving, as if waiting for him. Mark stopped a few feet away, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't speak, but he could feel its presence, its eyes, unseen but piercing, fixed on him. The air around him grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch out toward him, as if trying to pull him closer. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, pointing toward the pedestal. Mark's gaze followed the gesture, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw what lay before him. It was a journal, its pages worn and yellowed with age, its cover cracked and brittle. A name was etched into the leather binding, Elliot. The figure's voice broke through the silence, low and hollow, like the sound of a wind sweeping through a desolate cavern. You were never meant to know the truth, it said, its words carrying a weight of finality. But now you've come too far. You've seen too much. Mark's hands trembled as he reached for the journal, the weight of it heavy in his hands. He opened the cover, and the pages inside were filled with words, scrawled hastily in ink, as if the writer had been desperate to get them down before it was too late. He read the first line aloud, his voice trembling. The city is alive. It is not a place, but a being, and once you enter, there is no escape. The words sent a chill down his spine. He flipped through the pages, each one filled with more disturbing revelations. The journal detailed the horrors that had befallen those who had come before him, trapped in the city's grip. It described how the city fed on the souls of the lost, how it twisted and consumed everything that entered its realm, until there was nothing left but the endless, suffocating darkness. But as he turned the final page, Mark froze. The last words were not written in ink, but etched into the paper itself, as though carved by something sharp and unforgiving. You are next. The figure behind him moved, its presence looming closer, its hand still outstretched. Mark could feel the weight of its gaze, the oppressive darkness closing in around him. His breath quickened as panic surged within him. He had to escape. He had to get out. But the room was shrinking, the walls closing in, and the figure's voice echoed in his mind, repeating the same words over and over. "You are next." With a final, desperate cry, Mark bolted for the door, throwing it open and stepping back into the city. But no matter which direction he ran, the streets remained the same. The buildings loomed, the shadows stretched, and the figure's voice haunted him, growing louder and louder in his ears. The city had him. It always would. And as Mark ran deeper and deeper into the abyss, he knew one truth: he was lost. Forever. That's the end of the story. Tell me what you think about it.